The needle went into the base of Nadia Akafar's skull before she finished exhaling, and the last thing she heard in her own voice was a word she hadn't meant to say out loud. Wait. Nobody waited. Above her, the surgical arm rotated its second lead into place, and the vast black shape suspended over the excavation floor, the thing everyone on Kest Hollow called the God Engine, did nothing at all, the way it had done nothing for 9,000 years, the way it had done nothing to the 4 humans who came before her and did not walk out of this chamber. She had told herself she would not think about the 4. She thought about the 4. Hold still, said the surgeon standing over her, a tall gray-blue Illyri named Vithra Asa, whose voice through the translator collar always came out a half-second late and a half-tone flat, so that even urgency sounded like patience. The second lead seats into the C2 vertebra. You will feel pressure, not pain. You said that about the first one. I was wrong about the first one, Vithra said. I am rarely wrong twice. Nadia laughed, a short broken sound because it was that or scream, and screaming wasn't in the contract. Nothing about screaming was in the contract. The contract was 11 pages of legalese in a language her implant had to chew twice before it translated clean, and the only part that mattered was the part that said, if the procedure succeeded, the balance on her family's relocation debt, 140,000 credits, accrued the year the harvest domes on Meridian 6 failed and her mother's cooperative went under, would be cleared in full. If it failed, the debt transferred to her younger brother, who was 17 and building drainage pipe on a colony that ate people slowly, the way debt always did, one grinding shift at a time. She had signed. She had known what she was signing for. She had not fully understood, until she was strapped to a surgical frame 9 kilometers under the crust of a dead moon with 2 needles in her spine, exactly what it meant that the Illyri had run out of their own volunteers. The chamber around her did not look like a hospital. It looked like the inside of a cathedral built by something that had never heard of humility. The excavation had peeled back 400 meters of fused rock to expose it, a structure so large that its true shape still eluded the survey teams, black and faceted and threaded with dead channels of some material that was not quite metal and not quite bone, rising into a ceiling lost in gloom except where far above, a fracture in the ancient roof let a single shaft of gray daylight fall through drifting rock dust to the excavation floor. Scaffolding ringed the lower third of it, hung with equipment nobody on the dig team fully understood, cabling run by hands that had learned, over 11 years of careful, fruitless work, that this thing did not want to be understood. They called it the God Engine because the first survey team's translator had choked on the actual designation and spat out something close enough, and because after 11 years and 40 attempts by machines, by drones, by the finest instruments 7 allied worlds could build, nothing had gotten past the outer shell. No signal, no current. No response to heat, cold, pressure, resonance, or the crude patient prying of a scientific culture that had learned, the hard way, that this dead thing predated their entire recorded history by a margin too large to be comfortable. Then 2 years ago, someone had tried a human. Nobody had expected it to matter. Humans were labor on Kest Hollow, not scientists, cheap, hardy, desperate enough to sign contracts nobody sane would sign, and it was an intern's idea, floated as a joke during a funding review nobody wanted to attend. Try the species whose neural architecture kept showing up as an anomaly in every biological survey ever run near ruins like this one. The joke stopped being a joke the moment the first human subject went under the leads and the outer shell, for the first time in 9,000 years, for the first time in anyone's instrument's memory, registered a flicker. The subject had died 4 minutes later, so had the second. The third had lasted longer, nearly 9 minutes, long enough that Chief Surgeon Vithra Asa had come out of that operating theater with her hands shaking, an illusory gesture of something between grief and fascination that Nadia had only ever seen described in a briefing packet, never in person, until she watched Vithra's hands shake again 3 days ago over Subject 4. Subject 4's name had been Colton Reyes. He had been 26. He had liked bad music and had once fixed the water reclaimer in Nadia's dormitory block without being asked, and he was dead now. And today, he was the reason the leads went into Nadia's neck a full centimeter more gently than the reports said they'd gone into his. "Small mercies," she muttered. "Say again." "Nothing." She looked up past Vithra's shoulder at the shaft of daylight falling through the fracture in the roof, dust turning slow gold spirals in it, and made herself breathe the way the pre-op counselor had taught her, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, while somewhere behind her skull a machine that had watched empires rise and end kept its silence and waited to see if this one, finally, would be the one it answered. Vithra straightened, checked a readout none of the humans in the room were permitted to see, and looked down at her with an expression Nadia had learned, over 8 months on this dig, to read as something close to reluctant respect. "Third lead," Vithra said, "cortical bridge. This is the one that failed on the others." "I know." "You do not know. You were told it is different." Vithra's translator-flat voice found, for one moment, something almost gentle underneath it. "Akafar, if you want to stop, this is the interval to say so. After the third lead seats, we cannot safely withdraw for 6 minutes, whatever happens in that window." Nadia thought about her brother's hands, 17 years old and already calloused, laying pipe on a colony where the air recyclers failed on a schedule nobody bothered to fix because the workers were replaceable. She thought about her mother, who had stopped writing 8 months ago because there was nothing left to say that didn't cost more than she had. She thought, absurdly, about Colton Reyes fixing her water reclaimer and refusing to take the 6 credits she tried to give him, saying, "Keep it, buy something that isn't survival for once." "Do it," she said. The third lead went in. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Nadia felt the cold bloom of the anesthetic thread up through her jaw, felt her own pulse doing something erratic and unpleasant behind her ribs, heard Vithra's voice reciting numbers to a technician in the low, fast Illyri dialect, reserved for people who had stopped performing calm and started needing it. Then the pressure at the base of her skull changed. Not pain, not yet, but presence. A sensation like a held breath on the other end of a very long hallway, like something enormous had just, very quietly, turned its attention toward the door. Somewhere above her, in the dark upper reaches of the God engine's black hull, one single glyph, a hairline groove in a surface that had not so much as caught a photon's worth of active light in 9,000 years, began, faintly, to glow. Nobody in the operating theater saw it happen. Every human eye in the room was on the surgical readouts, on Nadia's vitals, on the frantic scroll of numbers nobody had names for yet. It was the observation gallery above the scaffolding, packed with off-shift dig workers and 2 members of the Illyri Consortium Oversight Board, who saw it first. A woman named Priya Anand, 12 years a structural engineer on this dig, and 11 years watching this thing do absolutely nothing, who happened to be looking up at exactly the wrong, exactly the right moment. She did not shout. She had spent 11 years learning not to hope out loud on this project. She just reached over without looking and gripped the sleeve of the man next to her, hard enough to bruise, and pointed. One glyph, pale gold, high on the eastern face of the hull, glowing like a coal someone had just breathed on. It was the first light the God engine had shown in 9,000 years, and it had chosen, out of 5 failed volunteers before her, to show it now. With Nadia Akafar's blood still warm around 3 needles sunk into the base of her skull, and her heart, for reasons she would not understand for another 11 minutes, beginning, very slowly, to slow down and match a rhythm that was not her own. Priya's shout finally came, half a second late, cracked wide open. Light, We have light eastern quadrant glyph 72 active now. The observation gallery erupted. Illyrie oversight officials who had spent a career cultivating the flat, patient calm of their species came half out of their seats. A junior tech dropped a data slate and didn't stop to pick it up. Down on the operating floor, Vithra Asa's head snapped up toward the readout that mattered more than any of the surgical ones. And for the first time since Nadia had met her, the surgeon's translator flat voice cracked into something with actual pitch in it. Confirmed, Vithra said. Cortical bridge is drawing a return signal. Repeat, we have a return signal. Is that good? Nadia's voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. The pressure behind her skull had deepened into something with weight now, like a hand resting flat against the inside of her mind, patient, assessing, not yet pushing. It is unprecedented, Vithra said, which was not an answer to the question Nadia had asked, and they both knew it. Overhead, threading down from glyph 72 like a slow crack spreading through frozen water, a second groove caught light. Then a third. Not simultaneous, sequential, deliberate, each one a full second behind the last. The pace of something waking up limb by limb and checking, with an old and careful patience, that each part still answered when called. Administrator Kel Asa, no relation to Vithra, the surname common among a particular caste lineage, arrived on the operating floor at a pace just short of undignified, flanked by two junior aides, and radiating the specific anxious authority of a man whose entire career now rode on the next 6 minutes. He had run this excavation's political side for 4 years, had defended its funding to a consortium board that wanted results, and had been given nothing but a growing casualty list. And Nadia had met him exactly twice, both times in rooms where she was furniture. Status, he said, not to her. Cortical bridge active. Return signal confirmed and strengthening. Subject vitals. Vithra glanced down, and whatever she saw made the flatness come back into her voice, deliberate now, controlled. Subject vitals are diverging from baseline human parameters. Diverging how? Heart rate is dropping, not arresting, synchronizing to an external rhythm. Kel Asa looked, for the first time since he'd entered the room, directly at Nadia. She watched him do the math a bureaucrat does in a crisis. Weigh the dead subjects against the funding review. Weigh the funding review against the very real fact that a 9,000-year silence had just broken on his watch, in his excavation, with his name attached to whatever came next. She had seen that calculation before, in supervisors, in loan officers, in the recruiter who'd signed her onto this contract with a smile that promised nothing, and delivered a corpse count of 4. Continue, he said. Sir, the previous 4 subjects experienced cardiac divergence at this exact interval, Vithra said. It preceded arrest in all 4 cases. The previous 4 subjects did not produce a second glyph. Kel Asa's voice had gone very quiet, very precise. This is the furthest this project has ever gotten. We are not stopping at the furthest point this project has ever reached. Continue. Nadia lay on the frame with 3 needles in her spine and listened to 2 aliens argue, in careful clinical language, about whether her heart slowing down was a data point or a death sentence, and found, underneath the fear, something that surprised her, a thread of anger, thin and hot, that steadied her more than the counselor's breathing exercise ever had. Hey, she said, and both of them looked down at her, startled as if the furniture had spoken. If I'm dying, I want to hear it from someone who will actually tell me. Vithra's translator caught up with something that might have been a wince. You are not dying. Your heart rate is dropping toward 41 beats per minute and stabilizing there. It is not the same pattern the others showed. Theirs climbed erratically before failure. Yours is, she paused, searching for a word the translator collar clearly didn't have loaded for this. Settling. Settling into what? I don't know, Vithra said, and it was the first time she'd said those 3 words to Nadia without the sentence built to soften them. Nothing in this project's history tells me what you're settling into. I only know it is not the shape death has taken here before. Overhead, the third glyph brightened, and a fourth, further out along an unseen seam in the hull, answered it, not lighting in sequence now but in near unison. A chain reaction finding its rhythm, gold light crawling across black stone metal bone in patterns too large and too old to have been designed for anything as small as being looked at. Rock dust sifted down from the ancient fracture in the roof, caught in the widening light, and for a moment the whole excavation floor seemed to hold its breath along with the observation gallery, along with Priya Anand's white-knuckled grip on a stranger's sleeve, along with Administrator Kel Asa standing very still with his hands folded behind his back in the practiced stillness of a man watching either his vindication or his catastrophe arrive, and unable yet to tell which. Nadia felt the hand pressing flat against the inside of her mind lift, just slightly, not gone, not withdrawn, but repositioned, the way a physician repositions a palm before pressing harder to check for a different kind of pain. Then it pressed harder. The world went white at the edges, not with light but with sensation, an intrusion so total and so strange that for one unbearable second she lost the operating theater entirely, lost Vithra's voice, lost the ceiling, lost the fact of her own body strapped to a frame 9 kilometers under alien rock, and found herself instead standing somewhere that was not a place at all, in a corridor built from a geometry her eyes kept sliding off of, lined on both sides with things that might have been doors or might have been eyes, all of them closed, all of them. She understood with a certainty that arrived without words, waiting for someone to knock. She had time to think, with the strange calm of a mind too overwhelmed to panic properly, that she recognized this corridor, not from memory, from somewhere older than her own memory had any right to reach. Then the pressure released her, all at once, and she was back on the frame, gasping, with Vithra's face 6 inches from hers and every alarm in the operating theater screaming at once. Heart rate, Vithra snapped at the technician monitoring the readouts. 38 beats per minute and holding steady, sir. It's not an arrest pattern, the rhythm is completely regular. It's just slow. Pupillary response. Reactive, she's conscious. Akafor, can you hear me? Nadia opened her mouth to answer and found the words came out strange, thickened, half a beat behind her own intention to say them, as if her voice had to travel further than it used to before it reached her lips. I saw a hallway, she managed. Doors. Or eyes, I don't know which. Vithra went very still. Behind her, Administrator Kel Asa's aides were already talking over each other into their comm units, the words excavation history, an unprecedented and full board notification, tumbling out faster than the translator collars could keep pace with. Describe it again, Vithra said, quiet now, urgent in a way that had nothing to do with the alarms. Exactly what you saw, take your time. But there was no time to take. High above them, the light crawling across the God engine's hull reached the base of what the survey teams had spent 11 years calling, for lack of a better term, the crown, a vast convergence point near the structure's apex, where hundreds of individual seams met and knotted together like the roots of a tree turned upside down and grown into stone. As the gold light touched it, the crown did something no instrument, no drone, no careful patient prying in 11 years of fruitless work had ever recorded it doing. It opened. The crown did not open like a door. It opened like a flower that had spent 9,000 years deciding it was safe to bloom, black petal plates sliding apart along seams too fine for any drone to have mapped, revealing beneath them a chamber of light so pale and so steady that half the observation gallery threw up an arm against it before their eyes adjusted, and found it was not, after all, blinding, only bright, only clean, only the first true light this excavation had ever coaxed out of 9,000 years of patient dark. Administrator Kel Asa's voice, when he finally found it, had lost every trace of bureaucratic calm. Get the full board on a live feed. Now. Whatever is happening in this room, they watch it as it happens, not in a summary I write tomorrow. Sir, subject vitals are stable, Vithra cut in, reading the display over the technician's shoulder with an intensity Nadia hadn't seen from her before. Heart rate 36 and holding. Brain activity is, she stopped. Is what? Coherent, Vithra said. It should not be coherent. At this level of cortical bridge saturation, the previous subjects showed seizure pattern activity within 90 seconds. Hers is organized. It looks, she hesitated again, and this time when she found the word, she said it like it cost her something to say it. It looks like conversation. Nadia, from somewhere very far inside her own skull, heard all of this the way a person hears a radio left on in another room, present but secondary, because the corridor of not doors had opened around her again, wider this time, and this time she was not alone in it. There was no shape to what stood at the corridor's far end, no shape her eyes could hold onto, no voice that arrived as sound so much as pressure translated, somewhere behind her sternum into meaning, but there was attention. Focused, ancient, patient attention, the kind that did not need to hurry because it had already waited longer than her species had existed, and it turned toward her now the way a lighthouse turns its beam, not searching, because it had already found what it was looking for, only confirming. Images arrived, not as pictures but as understanding, the way a word arrives already meaning something before you've finished reading it. She saw no, she was given, the way memory is given, not seen, a world of pale stone cities under 3 moons, and figures moving through them who were not human and were not Illyri, and were not anything she had a word for, tall and quick and burning faintly at the edges the way heat shimmers off summer pavement. She was given the sense of an oath. Not words feeling pressure, the shape a promise makes when a promise is the only architecture holding something together. She was given the sense of engines like this one, dozens of them, hundreds, scattered and buried and sealed across a gulf of space too large for the mind sending the memory to bother measuring in numbers a human would recognize. Each one a failsafe, a seed, a door left deliberately, carefully unlocked only to certain hands. Whose hands? That was the only question she managed to form clearly enough to ask, and the answer that came back was not a name. It was a lineage, a long, unbroken thread of inheritance reaching backward through more generations than she had any frame to hold, and at the near end of that thread, impossibly, unmistakably, herself. She surfaced gasping, and the operating theater came back around her in pieces. Ceiling, alarms, Vithra's face, the taste of copper in her mouth where she'd bitten her own tongue without noticing. Time, Vithra said sharply. How long was that? 40 seconds, the technician said. Her EEG spiked and then, sir, I've never seen a pattern like this. It's not seizure. It's structured, it's almost rhythmic. She's not fighting it, Vithra said, half to herself, watching Nadia's face with an expression that had stopped being purely clinical several minutes ago. Kafir, Nadia, can you speak? It's not trying to kill me, Nadia said. Her voice shook, but it held. It's trying to show me something. It keeps showing me the same corridor, the doors. And now it showed me. She stopped, because the next part didn't fit in a sentence yet, and saying it out loud in this room, in front of Kel Assa's aides and their open comm channels, and the entire consortium board watching on a live feed she hadn't consented to, felt like handing something private to people who had already decided, before she ever signed the contract, that whatever came out of her would belong to them. Showed you what? Kel Assa's voice from behind Vithra, too eager, too fast. Nadia looked at him and, for the first time in 8 months of being furniture on this dig, made a decision that was entirely her own. I don't know yet, she lied. It's not finished. Vithra's eyes flicked to her, one beat, no longer, and something passed between them that was not quite trust, not yet, but was the beginning of the shape trust takes. The surgeon turned back to the readouts and did not repeat the question. High above, the crown's petal plates had fully parted now, and light was pouring out of the opening in slow, unhurried pulses, gold going pale and pale going gold again, a rhythm that Priya Anand, watching from the gallery with her heart in her throat, realized after the third cycle was matching, precisely, unmistakably, the numbers scrolling on the medical display beside her. The engine was breathing in time with the woman strapped to its surgical frame. It synced to her pulse, Priya said aloud, to no one, to everyone. Sweet stars, it's breathing on her heartbeat. Word of that observation moved through the gallery faster than any comm channel could carry it, whispered from worker to worker, oversight official to aide, until it reached a woman standing near the back rail who had said nothing since the procedure began. A broad-shouldered field archivist named Son Vey, 40 years an Illyri veteran of digs on 6 worlds, who had opposed the human subject protocol from its first proposal 2 years ago, and had lost that argument 4 times over 4 graves she still visited in the excavation's small, quiet cemetery block. She watched the light pulse in time with a stranger's heartbeat, and felt something she had not let herself feel in 2 years, which was hope with teeth in it, hope that understood exactly what it would cost if it turned out to be wrong again. She left the rail without a word and started down toward the operating floor. Nobody stopped her. Nobody, in that moment, was looking at anything but the light. Down on the floor, the pressure behind Nadia's eyes gathered itself again, patient, deliberate, and this time when it opened the corridor for her she understood, with the sinking clarity of someone realizing a door only ever swings one further direction, that it was not finished showing her things, and that whatever came next would cost more than the last 40 seconds had. "It's coming back," she said, and heard her own voice go thin. "Vithra, it's coming back, it's not done." "Vitals holding," the technician called. "Whatever's happening, her body's tolerating it. I don't understand how, but it's tolerating it." "Then let it happen," Vithra said, and her voice for once had nothing clinical left in it at all. "Nadia, whatever it shows you, stay with it. Don't fight the current. I don't think this is a thing you can survive by fighting." Nadia had no time to answer. The corridor opened around her again, wider, deeper, and this time when the attention at its far end turned toward her, it did not simply look. It reached. The reach was not violent. It was the way a hand reaches for something it has been waiting 9,000 years to hold, careful past the point of caution, as if it had learned somewhere, sometime, how easily the thing it wanted could break. Nadia felt herself carried past the corridor of doors entirely now, out into an open space with no walls she could find, and the pale stone cities returned around her, closer this time, close enough that she could see individual figures moving between the towers, tall, quick, faintly burning at the edges, and every one of them, she understood without being told, wearing at their throats a small dark stone identical to the pendant Vithra had cut away from her collar during prep. The one Nadia's grandmother had given her, the one that had been in her family for longer than anyone alive could account for, passed hand to hand down a line of women who called it, with no explanation anyone remembered anymore, the warden's coin. She had never once, in 24 years of carrying it, wondered why a scrap of family jewelry from a colony with no recorded history, before the founding generation, was carved with a symbol that matched, exactly, stroke for stroke, the glyphs crawling gold across a 9,000-year-old alien engine. Now she wondered, and the thing at the far end of the reach answered before she finished forming the question, the way it always answered, not in words, but in certainty poured directly into the place where doubt used to live. The coin was not jewelry. It was a key that had forgotten, over uncounted generations of drift and loss and colonies founded and colonies failed, that it was a key at all carried by mothers to daughters not because anyone remembered why, but because some instructions survived the reasons behind them, worn smooth by repetition into habit, into superstition, into a small dark stone. A grandmother presses into a granddaughter's palm and says only, "Keep this. It's important," without either of them knowing what important meant. Nadia surfaced from that pass, gasping harder than the first, tears she hadn't given permission to fall running sideways into her hair, and found the operating theater in chaos that had nothing to do with her vitals. Full structural alert, a voice was shouting over the general noise. One of Kel Asa's aides, comm unit pressed hard against his skull ridge. Seismic sensors are picking up movement in the lower excavation levels. Sublevel 4 is reporting harmonic resonance in the support columns. Is it collapsing? Kel Asa's voice, sharp with an authority trying very hard to remain authority. Negative, sir. It's not collapse pattern, it's rhythmic, sir. The whole excavation's picking up a pulse. It's radiating out from the engine. Sonvei had reached the operating floor by then, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent 4 decades, learning that panic never got anyone through a collapsing dig faster than calm did. She caught Vithra's eye across the medical frame and said nothing, only tilted her head toward Nadia in a question that needed no translator collar to carry. She's tolerating it, Vithra said, answering the unspoken question. Better than tolerating. I think it's talking to her. After 9,000 years of talking to no one, Son said quietly. Of course it would take its time deciding what to say. Above them, the crown's pulse had quickened, gold to pale to gold cycling faster now, and with each cycle a fresh line of glyphs caught along the hull below it, spreading outward and downward like frost forming on a window in reverse, not growing colder but growing more awake, seam by ancient seam, until nearly a third of the god engine's visible surface carried some trace of light. Rock dust sifted continuously now from the fracture in the roof above, disturbed by a vibration too low for human ears to register as sound and too persistent to ignore as anything else. A bass note felt in the teeth and the sternum, and the soles of boots planted on the excavation floor. Priya Anand, still at the gallery rail, watched the light spread and thought about 11 years of instruments returning nothing. 11 years of drone probes coming back with data that amounted, in the end, to a very expensive shrug. 11 years of a project that had eaten 4 human lives and untold consortium funding for the privilege of confirming that something ancient and enormous was, in fact, still down there, still silent, still refusing to answer. She thought about how quickly 11 years of nothing could turn, in the space of 11 minutes, into everything, and found she had to sit down on the gallery bench before her knees admitted they'd stopped being reliable. Down on the floor, Administrator Kel Asa was on his own comm channel now, voice pitched for an audience well above his pay grade. Board, this is Asa, live from the excavation floor. We have confirmed cortical bridge integration with Subject 5 at a saturation level exceeding all previous attempts by an order of magnitude. Structure is responding. Repeat, the target structure is actively responding to human neural interface. I am requesting immediate authorization to. Authorization for what? Vithra's head came up sharply. Kel Asa did not lower the comm. To increase interface duration. If the connection is stable and the subject is tolerating it, we extend the window. We may not get another opportunity like this in. You will not increase anything, Vithra said, and her voice, translator lag and all, carried a flatness that had nothing to do with her species' usual calm and everything to do with fury held very precisely in check. Her cardiac rhythm is synchronized to an external system we do not understand and cannot predict. Extending exposure without knowing what we're extending her into is not research, administrator. It's exactly what killed the other 4, dressed up in better numbers. The other 4 didn't get a response, Kel Asa snapped. She did. That changes the calculation. It does not change the fact that she is a person and not a data point. Everyone in this excavation is a data point, surgeon myself included. That is what a research contract is. Stop. The word came from Nadia, and it came out stronger than anything she'd managed in the last 10 minutes, stronger than she felt, dragged up from somewhere underneath the fear because she had discovered, strapped to a frame with 3 needles in her neck, and an ancient mind pressed against the inside of her skull, that she still had exactly one thing in this room that belonged entirely to her, and that was her own voice, and she intended to use it before anyone else decided for her how it would be spent. Everyone looked down at her. Even Kel Asa, mid-argument, stopped. "It's not finished," she said, quieter now but no less certain. "It hasn't told me everything. It's not going to tell me everything if you're all shouting over each other about extending the window like I'm a piece of equipment you're deciding whether to overclock. Give me a minute. 1 minute, without an argument happening over my body while I'm in it." The silence that followed had weight. Son Vei, standing at the foot of the frame, was the one who finally broke it, addressing Kel Asa directly in a tone that made it clear she had earned the right to, 4 graves worth of earned right. "You heard the warden," she said. It was the first time anyone had used the word out loud, and Nadia felt it land in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Kel Asa's aides exchanging glances, Vithra's head turning sharply toward Son, the word itself hanging in the recycled air of the operating theater with a weight none of them had given it permission to carry yet. And above them all, as if in answer, a fourth of the crown's petal plates folded fully open, and the light pouring out of it changed color, gold shading slowly, unmistakably, into a deep and ancient violet. The color, though none of them would learn this for another several minutes, the engine's builders had once used to mark the seals reserved only for blood they recognized. Nadia did not get her minute. What she got instead was a third opening of the corridor, this one arriving without the courtesy of a pause, dragging her under so fast that the last thing she registered of the operating theater was Vithra's hand closing hard around her wrist, as if the surgeon meant to anchor her to her own body by main force if the connection tried to take more of her than it had already taken. This time the pale stone cities were burning. Not in the ordinary sense. The fire she saw moved wrong, folded through the towers in patterns that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with something being unmade at a level below matter. And the tall, quick figures who had walked so calmly between those towers in the last vision were running now, scattering, some of them turning back toward structures like the God engine, dozens of them. She understood, hundreds, scattered across worlds she had no names for, and doing something to them with their hands pressed flat against black holes, not unlike the one she lay beneath right now, sealing them, burying the failsafes deep and dark and silent, not because the engines had failed, but because whatever was unmaking the cities had learned, somewhere in that war, how to turn a waiting God into a weapon, and the builders had decided, in the last hours available to them to decide anything, that a weapon left unclaimed was safer than a weapon claimed by the wrong hand. She understood, with the same wordless certainty that had carried every other piece of this, that they had not expected to come back for what they buried. They had expected to lose. The engines were not meant to be recovered as tools of victory. They were meant to be a door left open a crack, generations later, for whoever survived long enough and carried enough of the old blood to remember how to knock. A seed planted in the wreckage of a war their builders knew, even as they lost it, that someone, someday, descended from them, scattered and forgetting and diminished, might need. The word for what she was being shown resolved, finally, into something close enough to human language to hold, not weapon, inheritance, not a throne to be seized, a duty to be resumed. She came back to herself with a sound that was half sob and half laugh, disoriented past the point of dignity, and found Vithra's face inches from hers again, the surgeon's grip on her wrist not loosening even slightly. "Talk to me," Vithra said, "now. Whatever you saw, I need it in words I can use to keep you alive, not held inside your own head." "They lost," Nadia said, the words coming out ragged. "Whoever built this, they lost a war. They buried the engines on purpose, not weapons, not for conquest. They're supposed to be found by their own bloodline later, when she had to stop, breathe, force the next part out before it could dissolve back into the wordless certainty it had arrived as. When someone's needed, when there's a reason to wake them up again. Needed for what? This from Kel Asa, who had not stepped back despite Vithra's earlier fury. Comm channel still open, the consortium board presumably still listening to every word. Nadia looked at him, and for the first time since the procedure began, she felt something in her chest that was not fear. It sat next to the fear, sharing space with it the way two people share a narrow bench, but it was not fear, and she recognized it slowly as the thing Sonve had named without permission a few minutes earlier. The beginning of a responsibility she had not asked for and could not, now that she had felt the shape of it, entirely refuse. "I don't know yet," she said, and this time it wasn't a lie. "It hasn't shown me that part." The tremor that had been running low and steady through the excavation floor for the last several minutes chose that moment to sharpen. A single hard jolt that rattled equipment on every level of scaffolding and sent a fresh cascade of rock dust pouring down through the fracture in the ceiling, thick enough now to catch visibly in the widening violet light. Structural integrity dropping on sublevels 3 through 6, the aide with the comm unit called out, voice cracking on the numbers. "It's not the excavation shaft, sir. The resonance is coming from deeper, from something below the engine's base, something we never mapped." Below it, Kel Asa's authority finally slipped all the way off, leaving underneath it something closer to plain fear. 11 years of survey, and there's a structure below it we never mapped. There wasn't anything there to map, sir. Sublevel 7 was solid rock until 90 seconds ago. Sonve moved to the edge of the frame and looked down at Nadia with the particular steadiness of someone who had buried 4 people and had decided in the space of the last quarter hour that she was not going to bury a 5th without a fight. "Akafar, Nadia, whatever's opening down there, it's opening because of you. Your connection is the key turning in more than one lock at once. Do you understand that?" "No," Nadia said honestly. "But I don't think understanding it is a requirement for it to keep happening." A low groan traveled up through the scaffolding, metal answering a strain it had not been built to answer, and somewhere on sublevel 4 a support column let go with a crack that echoed up the excavation shaft like a rifle shot. Workers on the lower levels were already moving toward the evacuation lifts, shepherded by shift foremen shouting instructions in 3 languages at once. And for one terrible second, the entire operation teetered on the edge of becoming exactly the kind of catastrophe 11 years of careful, fruitless caution had been designed to prevent. "Administrator," Vithra's voice cut through the noise, hard and final. "I am formally advising immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from sublevels 3 through 7, if this structure is destabilizing. If we pull everyone out now, we lose the only successful interface this project has ever achieved," Kel Asa said, but the fear in his voice had eaten most of the conviction out of the argument. "Son, you opposed this protocol from day one. Tell me I'm wrong to want to see it through." Sonve did not answer him directly. She looked instead at Nadia, at the violet light washing down over the medical frame from the crown far above, at the fine tremor running through the young woman's hands that had nothing to do with cold, and made a decision of her own. The kind of decision a person makes once they've stopped waiting for someone with more authority to make it for them. "Ask her," Son said. "She's the one wearing the needles. She's the one the engine is talking to. If anyone in this chamber has the right to decide whether we see this through, administrator, it isn't you and it isn't me. It's her." Every eye in the operating theater turned to Nadia Akafar. 24 years old, 8 months into a labor contract, she'd signed to save her family from a debt that had already cost one of her friends his life. 3 needles in her spine. A stranger's ancient certainty pressed against the inside of her skull, and a decision in front of her that no amount of counseling, no clause in any contract, could have prepared her to make. She thought about her brother laying pipe on a colony that ate people slowly. She thought about Colton Rays and the 6 credits he wouldn't take. She thought about a small dark stone her grandmother had pressed into her palm, and a corridor lined with doors that were also, somehow, eyes, all of them waiting for 9,000 years, for someone to finally knock back. "Finish it," she said. "Whatever's down there, whatever this is, I didn't come this far to leave the door half open." Vithra held her gaze for a long moment, searching for something, permission, maybe, or absolution, or simply the certainty that the choice had been made freely and not extracted from a desperate woman by an administrator with a board watching. Whatever she found, it settled something in her, because she nodded once sharply and turned back to the readouts with the particular focus of a surgeon who had decided, somewhere in the last 10 minutes, that her job was no longer to prevent this connection, but to carry the woman inside it through to the other side alive. "Fourth lead," Vithra said. "Full cortical saturation. Sohn, get everyone off sublevels 3 through 7 who isn't essential to keeping her breathing. Administrator, if you want to watch, you watch from behind that line, and you do not open your mouth again until I tell you it's safe to." Kel-Asa, for once, said nothing at all. The fourth lead went in, and the corridor of doors opened around Nadia one final time, wider than it had ever opened, and this time, at its far end, the ancient attention that had spent 9,000 years waiting did not simply reach for her. It stepped through. There was no sensation of falling, no sound, no light beyond the low violet wash that had filled the corridor of doors from end to end. There was only, suddenly, a shape where before there had only been attention, tall, and made of something that caught the violet light without quite reflecting it, its edges shivering faintly the way heat shivers off pavement, exactly as the burning figures in the vision had shivered. And Nadia understood, with a lurch that had nothing to do with vertigo, that she was looking at the nearest thing this place could offer to a face. It did not speak the way Vithra spoke, in sound shaped by breath and tongue. It spoke the way the visions had spoken, meaning arriving whole and immediate. But this time, for the first time since the leads went into her spine, there was a texture to it that felt less like memory being poured into her and more like a question being asked, patient and old, and underneath the patience, something that might in a living throat have been called hope. "Show me what you carry." She didn't know how to answer that, didn't know what it was asking her to show, until she felt something in her own chest respond before her mind had finished catching up: the coin. Not the coin itself, gone now, cut away and set aside somewhere in a tray in the operating theater, but the shape of it, the weight of it, 24 years of her grandmother's hands and her mother's hands and hands further back than either of them, worn into a memory so deep it had outlasted the object itself. She offered that, the only way she knew how, which was simply to stop hiding it, to let the shape of the coin and everything it had been carried through sit open and visible in whatever space this was. The response that came back was not words. It was recognition, total and immediate, the kind of recognition a parent has for a child's face across a crowded room, the kind that does not require confirmation, because it arrived before doubt had time to exist. And underneath the recognition, spreading through the space between them like light finding the edges of a room, was grief, old, vast, patient grief, the grief of something that had waited 9,000 years not knowing whether anyone would ever come to answer, and had, in all that waiting, quietly stopped hoping without ever quite managing to stop watching the door. "You are late," the meaning arrived, and there was something in it that might, in a human throat, have been rye. You are the latest of a very long line of late. Nadia felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with the needles in her spine. A laugh, disbelieving, half a sob riding underneath it. "I didn't know I was supposed to be anywhere." Neither did they, at the end, the meaning answered, and this time there was no wryness in it at all, only the flat weight of an old loss carried a very long time. That was the cost of the door swinging shut. The ones who buried us could not stay to teach what waited on the other side. We accepted that cost when we chose to seal ourselves rather than be turned into what our enemies wanted us to become. We did not accept, easily, watching that cost paid out over so many generations of silence. Around them, the shivering violet light began slowly to sharpen, resolving, the way a held breath resolves into a full exhale, into something with edges, with detail, with a shape Nadia's mind could almost hold on to. She realized she was being shown, not told, what had happened after the sealing. Generations of a scattered people, drifting further and further from any memory of what they had once guarded, colonies rising and falling across centuries she had no names for, a lineage thinning and mixing and forgetting, until all that remained of an oath sworn by burning figures in pale stone cities was a small dark stone pressed from mother to daughter with a single unexplained instruction. Keep this. It's important, carried forward not because anyone remembered the reason, but because some habits outlive their reasons, worn into the bone of a family, the way a river wears a channel into stone long after anyone remembers what carved it first. You've been waiting this whole time, Nadia said, and found her voice, in this place that wasn't quite a place, sounded steadier than it had any right to. Every attempt, every human they sent down here, you were waiting to see if any of them carried it. Every door refuses every hand that is not its key, the meaning answered. It is not cruelty. It is the only mercy we had left to give, that no stranger's hand could turn us into what we were sealed against becoming, even by accident, even in ignorance. The four who came before you did not carry the blood. We could not answer them. We could only watch them try, and fail, and grieve that failure exactly as we grieve every failure that has crossed this threshold in 9,000 years. Because grief was the only gift we had left to offer anyone who came without the key. It was not comfort exactly, what settled into Nadia's chest at that, not comfort, but something adjacent to it, a kind of terrible clarity. Colton Reyes had not died for nothing in the sense of dying meaninglessly, but he had died because the door could recognize him well enough to grieve him and not well enough to open for him, and there was no version of that fact that did not hurt, and the thing across from her did not try to make it hurt less. It simply let the grief sit between them, honest and unhidden, the way she suspected it had let every grief sit for 9,000 years, because pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie, and whatever else this ancient, patient, exhausted intelligence was, it did not appear to deal in comfortable lies. Back in the operating theater, though Nadia had no way of knowing it in the moment, the 5th minute of full cortical saturation was passing in a silence so total that even Kel Assa's aides had stopped whispering into their comm units. Vithra stood with both hands braced on the edge of the medical frame, watching a brainwave pattern scroll across the display that no textbook in Illyri medical history had ever described, structured and rhythmic, and utterly unlike anything the previous 4 subjects had produced in their final, failing minutes. Sohn Vei stood at the foot of the frame with her arms folded, eyes fixed on Nadia's face, watching for the flicker of distress that would tell her it was time to override every protocol in the excavation and pull the leads herself, contract and consortium and career be damned. It did not come. What came instead, slowly, was something that made Vithra's breath catch audibly in her throat, a faint, steady curve at the corner of Nadia's mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shape that no one in the room mistook it for pain. "She's not suffering," Vithra said, half to herself, half to Sohn. "Whatever's happening in there, she's not suffering." "No," Sohn agreed quietly, watching the same faint curve settle deeper into Nadia's unconscious face. "I don't think she is." High above them, the crown had opened fully now, all its petal plates spread wide, violet light pouring upward through the fracture in the ancient roof to meet the gray daylight falling down through it. The 2 lights mixing in the drifting rock dust into something that had no name in any language spoken on that excavation floor. Not quite gold, not quite violet, but a color the survey teams would spend the next several years failing to adequately photograph, because every image they captured came out looking, however faintly, like something with its own light behind it, refusing to be reduced to a flat picture, the way the God engine itself had spent 9,000 years refusing to be reduced to anything a database could fully hold. And below the excavation floor, in the newly opened space beneath the engine's base that no survey in 11 years had ever mapped, something vast and long dormant continued, patiently, to stir. The stirring reached the surface 9 minutes later, and it did not arrive gently. A klaxon Nadia had never heard before, because it had never once, in 11 years of excavation, had caused a sound, cut through the operating theater in 3 short, ugly bursts. Every readout on the wall behind Vithra flared amber at once, and the technician monitoring the seismic feed made a sound that was not a word so much as the beginning of one, cut off by disbelief. "Report," Vithra snapped, not looking away from Nadia's vitals. "Sublevel 8, the space that opened under the engine's base. It's not empty, sir. There's a secondary structure down there and it just came online. Power signature spiking." The technician's hands moved fast over the console, translating raw alarm into something like sense. "It's arming something. I don't have a better word for it. Whatever's down there, it's arming." Sonvay was at the console in 3 strides, reading over the technician's shoulder with the flat, focused calm of someone who had survived enough dig site emergencies to know that panic was a luxury for later. "That's not part of the engine," she said after a moment. "Look at the architecture. It's a different build entirely, cruder, faster, built for one purpose. This isn't a failsafe. This is a trap." "A trap for what?" Kel-As's voice had climbed half an octave. "For exactly what's happening right now." Son straightened, and for the first time since Nadia had met her, the older woman looked genuinely frightened, not for herself. "Think about what she told us. They lost a war. Whoever came after them learned how to turn a sealed God engine into a weapon. If I were losing that war and I couldn't guarantee my own engines would only ever wake for the right hands, I'd build one more failsafe. A purge system. Something to destroy the engine outright the instant it detected unauthorized activation, so that even if the enemy found a way to force it open, they'd get nothing but wreckage for their trouble." "And if it's not unauthorized?" Vithra's question was sharp, urgent. "If the activation is legitimate, if it's her?" "Then somewhere in that system's design, there's supposed to be a verification step," Son said. "A window where the purge waits to see if the key really is the key before it commits to destroying everything, rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. The question is whether 9,000 years of drift left that verification step intact, or whether it degraded into something that just arms and fires the second it senses activity it doesn't recognize." "How long until it fires?" The technician didn't look up from the console. "Power curve says 6 minutes, maybe 7 if we're lucky." "It's not a guess. I'd bet a life on, sir." Every eye in the room went, once again, to the woman on the frame, 3 needles in her spine, unconscious to everything happening around her, still carrying on her unconscious face that faint curve that was not quite a smile. A woman who had, without knowing it, 6 or 7 minutes to either finish becoming whatever this place had been waiting 9,000 years for her to become, or die along with everyone still on the lower excavation levels when a war-era failsafe decided, on insufficient information, that she was the enemy. "Pull the leads," Kel-Asa said. "Now. If there's a chance this kills her regardless, we don't let it kill her slowly on our schedule. If we pull the leads mid-saturation, cortical shock alone could stop her heart in under a minute," Vithra said, "and that assumes the purge system doesn't read a sudden severed connection as exactly the kind of unauthorized interference it's built to punish. We have no data. None. Every option in front of us is a guess dressed up as a decision." "Then we need a better guess than that in the next 6 minutes," Son said, and turned, finally, to the one voice in the room that had actually been inside the system in question, even if that voice belonged to a body that could not currently answer. It was Priya Anand, watching from the gallery with white knuckles and a structural engineer's instinct for load-bearing problems, who said the thing none of them had thought to say out loud yet. She's not unconscious, Priya called down, voice carrying over the klaxon's dying echo. Look at her face. She's not gone somewhere and left her body behind for us to argue over. She's still in there doing something. Maybe the only person who can actually stop that purge system in the next 6 minutes is the one person in this room already talking to it. The theater went quiet in a way that had weight to it, everyone's attention turning at once to the frame, to the small, steady, unpanicked curve at the corner of Nadia Akafar's mouth, and to the violet gold light still pouring down from the fully opened crown far above, unbroken, unhurried, as if nothing in the world 9 kilometers above it had changed at all. Vithra looked at the countdown on her readout, 5 minutes and 40 seconds now, and falling, and made the only decision left that didn't amount to a coin flip with a woman's life on the table. Then we don't interrupt her, she said. We trust that whatever's happening in there, it's happening for a reason, and we give her every second of the time she has left to finish it. Vithra, Kel-Asa started. You've spent 4 years arguing that this project needed results, Administrator. Vithra's voice cut clean through his objection, flat and final in a way that left no room for the argument to continue. You have your results. A living connection, a responding structure, and a woman who has not once in the last 15 minutes asked us to stop. I am not going to sever a working bond on the strength of a guess, when the alternative is trusting the only person in this excavation who has actually been inside that system to finish what she started. 5 minutes. Everyone not required to keep her alive gets off this floor now. Nobody argued further. The theater emptied in a fast, controlled scramble, aides, non-essential techs, even Kel-Asa retreating, pale and silent, to the gallery stairs, until only Vithra, Sohn, and the one technician monitoring the countdown remained on the operating floor with Nadia, the 3 of them standing in the widening violet gold light like witnesses at a vigil none of them had signed up to keep. Inside the place that was not a place, Nadia felt none of the countdown ticking away above her. What she felt was the shape of a question finally being asked plainly, without visions, without memory, direct as a hand extended across a threshold 9,000 years wide. There is a ward beneath this seat. The meaning arrived, grave now, urgent in a way the earlier exchanges had not been. It was built by hands other than ours in the last days of the war, grafted into our foundation without our full consent, because the ones who besieged us learned to force engines like this one open by force, and our own people would rather see us destroyed than turned into a weapon against everything we swore to protect. It does not know your blood. It only knows that something is moving inside me that has not moved in 9,000 years, and it has been built to answer that fact with fire. Then tell it, Nadia said, and heard her own voice arrive in that place with more certainty than she'd managed anywhere in the last 20 minutes. Tell it what you told me. Show it the coin, show it whatever you need to show it. I cannot speak to it directly. It was not built to listen to me. It was built to listen for the absence of the key, and it has heard nothing from this seat but silence for 9,000 years, which is the only condition under which it has ever been asked to act. Then what can I do? The shape across from her did not answer immediately, and in the silence Nadia felt, for the first time since the corridor first opened around her, something that might have been the ancient intelligence's own uncertainty, old, weighed carefully, and offered to her honestly rather than smoothed over. You can go to it yourself, the meaning finally arrived, not through me, through the part of you that already carries what it is built to recognize. It is a cruder thing than I am, and cruder things are, sometimes, easier to convince if you know exactly what to show them and do not flinch while you show it. I don't know how to do that. You have been doing it since the moment the third lead touched your spine. The answer came, and for the first time, Nadia thought she caught something that was almost warmth threaded through the ancient patience of it. You have simply not yet been asked to do it on purpose. The shape of the ward, when Nadia finally turned toward it, was nothing like the ancient intelligence she had been speaking with, where the engine's presence had felt like an ocean, vast, patient, containing more history than she could hold. The ward felt like a blade left standing on its point, balanced, humming, built for exactly one function and nothing else. It did not have a face. It did not have anything close to warmth. It registered her the instant she turned her attention toward it, and what came back across the gap between them was not language at all, only a single, flat, absolute proposition. Unauthorized terminate. Wait, Nadia said, and felt, even as she said it, how small the word sounded against something built with no room in its architecture for waiting. Countdown active, no override credential detected. She had no idea what an override credential looked like, no idea what language this crude, fast, war-built thing spoke in, if it spoke in anything recognizable as language at all. What she had was the same thing she'd had every other time this ordeal had asked more of her than she thought she carried. The coin's shape, worn into memory deeper than the object itself, a lineage stretching back through mothers and grandmothers, and a debt of blood she had not chosen and could not now set down. She stopped trying to speak to the ward in words it might understand and did, instead, exactly what she had done for the engine itself. She stopped hiding. She opened everything: the coin, the corridor of doors, the pale stone cities and the fire that unmade them wrong at a level below matter. The oath she had felt more than heard, sworn by burning figures at the edge of a war they knew they were losing. 24 years of her own life folded into the offering without her quite meaning to include it, her mother's silence, her brother's calloused hands, Colton Ray's refusing 6 credits, the 4 graves in the excavation's quiet cemetery block, every debt paid and unpaid that had brought her, finally, to this frame, this needle, this impossible ancient machine that had chosen, out of 5 desperate strangers, to recognize something in her blood that she herself had not known was there to recognize. She showed it everything, and did not flinch while she showed it, because the alternative, hiding any part of herself from a system built to detect exactly that kind of hesitation, felt, in that moment, more dangerous than being fully seen. The ward was silent for a length of time that had no measure in that place, and somewhere far above, in the operating theater, the countdown ticked past the 3-minute mark, then 2 minutes 40, then 2:30, Vithra's eyes fixed on the display with the particular stillness of someone counting seconds they have no power to slow. Then in the space that was not a place, something in the ward's flat, absolute architecture shifted, not warmed. Nothing that crude and old and single-purposed was capable of warmth. But it recalculated, the way a machine recalculates when new data finally clears a threshold it had been built, in some careful, half-forgotten corner of its design, to require before it committed to destruction. Partial credential match, verification protocol resuming, countdown suspended pending confirmation. Relief did not arrive the way Nadia expected it to. It arrived exhausted, thin, stretched over something that still had not fully released her, because suspended was not the same as stopped, and confirmation was not a word that told her what would happen if whatever came next failed to satisfy a system that had already, once, decided she was close enough to a threat to arm itself against her. Show the rest, the engine's ancient voice returned, threading back into the space now that the ward's attention had eased. It has recognized enough of you to pause. It has not yet recognized enough of you to stand down. There is one thing left it requires, and it is not a thing I can show for you because it is not a memory. It is a choice made now by you freely. What choice? Whether you accept what the recognition means. Not the blood is already yours, whether you accept it or not. The duty. The ward was built to guard against a weapon being seized by the wrong hand. It will not stand down for a hand that only wants to take. It will only stand down for a hand that means to carry what it takes. Nadia thought, in the strange suspended time of that place, about everything she had been shown, the burning cities, the oath sworn in a language that had outlived its own speakers, the small dark stone worn smooth across generations of women who kept a promise they no longer remembered making. She thought about Colton Reyes, who had died trying to answer a door that had never once, in 9,000 years, opened for anyone who wasn't asking the right question. She thought about her brother on a colony that ate people slowly, and her mother's silence, and the specific, particular unfairness of being handed an inheritance, this vast in the middle of the worst week of her life, with a purge system's countdown ticking down somewhere she couldn't see, and no time left to decide anything the way a person should be given time to decide something this large. And she thought, underneath all of it, about the fact that she had already made this choice, in every meaningful sense, the moment she told Vithra to finish what they'd started rather than pull the leads and walk away with her debt cleared, and her curiosity forever unanswered. She had already chosen to carry it. She had simply not yet said so out loud, to the one part of this whole impossible day that was actually asking. "I accept it," she said, and the words arrived steady, unhurried, the truest thing she had said since the needle first went into the base of her skull. "Whatever it means, whatever it costs going forward, I'm not doing this to take something. I'm doing it because 4 people died trying to knock on this door before me, and somebody who actually carries the key should be the one who finally answers it properly, instead of leaving it for a 5th grave, or a 6th, or however many it would have taken before this excavation gave up entirely." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it, not calculation this time, but something closer to acknowledgement, ancient and total, and, for the first time since the corridor first opened around her, entirely without grief in it. Credential confirmed, the ward's flat architecture returned, and even in its crude, unadorned language there was, unmistakably, a kind of finality that had stopped being a threat. Countdown terminated. Ward standing down. Custody transferred. Above her in the operating theater, the countdown display Vithra had not once let herself blink away from held at 41 seconds, hung there for a breath, 2 breaths, 3, and then all at once, dropped to 0 and simply stopped, the amber alarm lights across every readout in the room fading, one by one, back to the steady, unremarkable green of a system that had, against every probability the last 15 minutes had suggested, decided not to end anyone's life today. Sonve let out a breath she had clearly been holding since the klaxon first sounded, a long, shaking exhale that dissolved, halfway through, into something that was almost a laugh. "It stood down," she said, disbelieving. "Vithra, it actually stood down." Vithra didn't answer right away. She was watching Nadia's face, the faint curve at the corner of her mouth deepening now into something unmistakable, something that had crossed the line from not quite a smile into an actual, small, exhausted smile. And above them, filling the whole excavation chamber from the fully opened crown down to the scaffolding ringing its base, the violet gold light that had been pulsing in time with a stranger's heartbeat for the last 20 minutes steadied, brightened, and began, for the first time in 9,000 years, to shine with the calm, unwavering constancy of a system that had finally, fully, irrevocably, come back online. What happened next, none of the survey team's instruments fully captured, though every one of them tried. The light pouring down from the crown gathered itself, over the space of perhaps 10 seconds, into something that had never once in 9,000 years of silence been seen by anyone still capable of describing it. A shape, standing in the light at the base of the crown's opening, humanoid in the loosest possible sense, edges shivering the way heat shivers off pavement, exactly as it had appeared to Nadia in the place that was not a place, except that now it was here, visible, undeniable. Standing in the same daylight and glowlit air as every living witness on that excavation floor. Priya Anand, back at the gallery rail, would spend the rest of her life trying to describe what she felt in that moment, and never quite managing it to her own satisfaction. Not fear, though there was something in the sheer scale of the presence that made fear a reasonable response available and simply unclaimed. Awe, she would eventually settle on, the plain old word underneath all the more sophisticated ones she tried first. Awe, the kind that made you go still and quiet and glad, on some level below language, to have been alive to see it. Around the gallery and the lower scaffolding, dig workers who had spent 11 years excavating a silence went, one by one, to their feet, or their knees, or simply stood very still with their hands pressed to their chests in the old Illyrie gesture of witnessed wonder, mouths open, eyes wide, leaning forward without quite meaning to. The way a body leans toward a fire on a cold night, whether or not the mind has decided yet that the fire is safe. Down on the operating floor, Vithra released Nadia's wrist for the first time in 11 minutes, not because the danger had passed. She would not fully believe that until the leads came out and the vitals held steady on their own, but because some instinct older than her medical training told her that whatever was happening now required room, not restraint. The shape in the light did not speak at first to the room. It looked, for a long moment that stretched taut across the whole silent chamber, only at the woman on the frame, 3 needles still seated at the base of her skull, eyes open now, fully conscious, fully present, meeting a gaze that had waited 9,000 years to be met. Then, in a voice that arrived the way the glyphs had arrived, not sound exactly, but something that every mind in that chamber, human and Illyrie alike, received and understood in whatever language it natively thought in it spoke, and this time it spoke for everyone to hear. Wardenblood confirmed, the seal is answered. The words landed in the chamber like a struck bell, and for a moment nobody moved, nobody breathed, the entire excavation floor suspended in the particular silence that follows a sound too large for the room to immediately absorb. Nadia, still strapped to the frame, still trembling with the aftershock of everything the last 20 minutes had asked of her, found her voice before anyone else in the room found theirs. "I don't," she started and had to stop, swallow, try again. "I don't know what that makes me, what I'm supposed to do now." The shape's shivering edges shifted, something in its bearing that might, on a human face, have been the ghost of something gentler than the vast old grief it had carried through every prior exchange. "It makes you the first hand to answer this door in 9,000 years, it said. "What you do with that is not owed to me. It was never owed to me. The oath was never that whoever answered would serve the engine. The oath was that the engine would serve whoever answered faithfully, for as long as they carried the need to be served, and would stand beside them, against whatever forced the door shut in the first place, should it ever return." "Is it going to return?" This from Sonve, stepping forward without quite seeming to decide to, 40 years of dig site caution overridden by something more urgent. "Whatever unmade those cities, is it still out there?" "I do not know," the shape said, and there was no comfort offered in the honesty of it, only the plain, unadorned truth of an intelligence that had already shown Nadia it did not deal in comfortable lies. 9,000 years is a long silence on both sides of this seal. I have no way to know what waits beyond it, only that I was built to endure and to watch, and to wait for exactly this moment, a hand carrying enough of the old blood, and enough of the old will to open the door on purpose rather than by accident or force. That has now happened. What comes next is not written anywhere I have access to. It will be written by what you, and whoever stands with you, choose to do with what has woken here today. Administrator Kel Asa, who had retreated to the gallery stairs during the countdown and had not moved since, found his voice at last, thin and stripped of every trace of the authority he'd carried into the room an hour ago. "Are there others?" he called down, and the question, however self-interested its origin, was the one every scientist and administrator in that chamber had been holding since the first vision of scattered, buried engines had leaked, second-hand, into the room's collective understanding. Other engines, other seals like this one. The shape turned its shivering, faceless attention toward the gallery, and something in the gesture carried, unmistakably, the weight of an answer that would outlast this single afternoon by a very long time. "Many," it said. Scattered across a gulf of stars your instruments have not yet learned to cross, buried the way I was buried, waiting the way I waited. I have been silent to them for 9,000 years, the way I was silent to everyone, because a sealed door cannot call to other sealed doors without risking exactly the kind of discovery that ended the war which built us in the first place. That silence ends now. The moment the seal broke, the signal I was built to carry began traveling again, slow, ancient, patient, the way everything about us is patient but traveling. Somewhere across that gulf, other doors like mine will begin, very quietly, to remember they are doors. The chamber absorbed that in a silence heavier than any that had come before it, because it was, everyone standing in that room understood at once, no longer a story about one excavation, one engine, one desperate contract worker with a family debt and a grandmother's coin. It was the first thread pulled loose from something far larger, a network of dormant, ancient failsafes scattered across the stars, all of them built by the same lost hands, all of them sealed by the same lost war, all of them waiting, the way this one had waited, for a bloodline that had spent 9,000 years forgetting it was owed a door at all. Vithra Asa, standing at the foot of the frame with her hand still faintly trembling from 11 minutes of holding a stranger's wrist through a crisis no medical training had prepared her for, looked up at the shivering, ancient shape and asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment, the surgeon's question underneath every larger one the room was asking. Will it hurt her? Whatever's connected now, is she safe? The shape's attention shifted to Vithra, and something in it, not warmth still, but a kind of careful, deliberate courtesy, inclined toward her the way a great weight inclines toward something it has decided, provisionally, to trust. The bond is not a wound, it said. It does not drain her, or diminish her, or claim any part of her that was not already, by blood, mine to answer. She will carry it the way she has carried the coin her whole life, quietly, mostly unnoticed, present at the edges of ordinary days, until a day comes that needs it to be more. I have waited 9,000 years to be careful with the hand that finally opened this door. I do not intend to stop being careful now. Nadia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and felt, for the first time since the needle first touched the base of her skull, something in her chest ease all the way down to a place fear had occupied for the last hour without contest. She looked past the shivering shape, up through the fully opened crown, to the single shaft of gray daylight still falling through the ancient fracture in the roof, dust turning slow gold-violet spirals in air that no longer held its breath, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not thinking about her family's debt, or Colton Ray's grave, or the 11 pages of contract that had brought her down here in the first place. She was thinking instead about the word door, and how many different things it could mean, and how strange it was to discover, at 24 years old, 9 kilometers under an alien moon, that she had spent her entire life being one. The leads came out one at a time, Vithra's hands steady and unhurried despite the hour they just survived, each withdrawal met with a small flare of readouts that settled, every time, back into the calm green rhythm of a body, no longer carrying more than its own single, ordinary heartbeat. When the third lead slid free, Nadia felt the pressure that had sat against the inside of her skull for the last hour ease back, not vanish. She understood now, never fully vanish, but recede the way a tide recedes, leaving behind in its wake the unmistakable outline of the shore it had touched. "How do you feel?" Vithra asked, crouching to bring her face level with Nadia's, the translator lag doing nothing to soften the raw concern underneath the clinical phrasing. "Like I ran somewhere very far and came back with sand still in my shoes," Nadia said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it as something close to a joke, and that she had enough left in her to make it. "Tired. Not hollowed out, just tired." "That is the correct kind of tired," Vithra said, and something in her flat translator voice carried, for once, an emotion that needed no interpretation at all. I have spent 2 years dreading every version of what might happen when a subject's vitals did what yours just did. I did not once, in all that dread, imagine it would end with you making a joke about your shoes. Sonve helped ease Nadia upright on the frame, steadying her through the first dizzy wave of sitting after nearly an hour flat on her back with her spine wired into a 9,000-year-old machine. You did something today 4 better people than me didn't manage, Son said quietly, close enough that it didn't carry to the rest of the room. I opposed this protocol from the day it was proposed. I want you to know that wasn't about you. I didn't think any human life was worth what this project was gambling with it. I still don't, entirely. But I watched what you did in that last stretch, with the ward, and I'm not going to pretend I understand the math of what you weighed to make that choice. I just know you made it, and it was the right one, and Colton and the other 3 would have wanted somebody to say that out loud instead of letting it just sit as a number in a report. Nadia's throat tightened, and she nodded rather than trust her voice with an answer, and Son, reading the moment correctly, said nothing further, only rested a broad hand briefly on her shoulder before straightening to face the rest of the operating floor, where Administrator Kel Asa had finally found his way back down from the gallery stairs, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had spent the last several minutes recalculating, from the ground up, everything he thought he understood about the project bearing his name. Board notification is already out across the full consortium network, he said, to no one in particular, his voice still not entirely steady. Every affiliated world with a research charter is going to want a statement inside the hour. He stopped, looked at Nadia, and for the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been genuine humility crossed his face rather than the practiced performance of it. I don't know what the correct statement is for something like this. 11 years of planning went into every contingency except this one. Then don't give them a statement yet, Vithra said, not unkindly. Give them the truth, which is that we don't fully understand what happened here today, and we are not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a press cycle. Subject, she paused and corrected herself deliberately, the correction costing her nothing and meaning Nadia understood quite a lot. Nadia needs rest, food, and about 6 hours before anyone asks her another question that matters. Kel Asa nodded slowly, some of the color returning to his face now that a decision had been handed to him rather than demanded of him. 6 hours, he agreed. I'll hold the board off that long. After that, we'll see what she's willing to give them, Son said, in a tone that made it clear the sentence was not open for negotiation from anyone but Nadia herself. They moved her to a recovery bay 3 levels up, away from the operating theater, away from the observation gallery still buzzing with dig workers who couldn't stop talking about what they'd seen, away from the klaxon's fading echo and the amber alarm lights that had, for 6 terrifying minutes, threatened to end the day very differently. The recovery bay had a narrow window, the excavation's one genuine luxury, looking out not onto the dig itself but onto Kest Hollow's thin gray sky, cut by the distant, glinting shapes of orbital transports, and further out, the pale curve of the moon's larger neighbor rising slow and silver over the horizon. Nadia lay in the narrow bed and looked at that sky for a long time, feeling at the edges of her own thoughts, a presence that was not quite thought and not quite memory, the engine, or the part of it now threaded quietly through whatever the leads had left behind, not intruding, not pressing, simply there, the way a held breath is there even after you've stopped consciously holding it. Are you always going to feel like this? She asked it, not entirely sure if she was asking out loud or only in the part of her mind that had learned, in the last hour, how to be heard by something that had no ears. Not always the same, the answer came, quieter now than it had been in the chamber, settled into something closer to companionship than revelation. You will not carry a stranger in your skull, Nadia Akafer. You will carry a door, one you can open or leave closed as the day requires. I will not speak unless you ask me to, or unless something arrives that both of us need to answer together. I have waited 9,000 years to learn patience. I am not going to abandon that lesson in my first day back among the living." She almost laughed at that. The ancient, grieving, terrifyingly vast intelligence that had just reshaped the entire trajectory of an 11-year excavation project, promising, in essence, not to be annoying about it, and found that the laugh, when it came, was easier than any laugh had been in the 8 months since she'd signed her contract. The 6 hours Vithra had bought her did not, in the end, hold entirely. Word had already reached the consortium's regional administration by the time Nadia woke from a thin, dreamless sleep, and reached, somewhat more slowly but far more consequentially, the small human labor office on the far side of the excavation complex that handled contract records for every worker on Kest Hollow. It was Sohn Vey, not Vithra, who brought her that particular piece of news, arriving at the recovery bay with a data slate in one hand, and an expression Nadia had not yet learned to read on the older woman's face. "Your contract's been flagged," Sohn said, without preamble, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Emergency review, consortium board authority, effective this morning. I want to be clear that I don't know exactly what it means yet, because nobody down here has ever had a contract flagged this way before. But the preliminary note says outstanding debt obligation, subject designation, suspended pending full review, and every person in that labor office I've ever dealt with in 4 years is treating this like it's already decided." Nadia sat up too fast, the room tilting briefly before it settled. "Suspended how? Cleared or just frozen or?" "I asked the same question and got the same non-answer twice," Sohn said. "I think, honestly, nobody down in that office has the authority to answer it, because nobody down in that office has ever had to process what you are now. You're not labor category anymore, Nadia. I don't know what category you are. I don't think the consortium's paperwork has a box for it yet." It should have felt like good news, and some distant, exhausted part of Nadia recognized that it probably was, eventually, going to feel like good news. But in the moment, sitting up in a narrow recovery bed with her skull still faintly aching where 3 needles had spent the better part of an hour rewriting what her nervous system understood about the shape of her own life, it mostly just felt like one more enormous, unfamiliar weight added to a day that had already handed her more weight than she knew how to carry gracefully. "My brother," she said, the thought arriving sudden and urgent. "If my contract's frozen, does that mean the debt transfer clause is frozen too? Because if it isn't, if something goes wrong in the review and the debt just moves to him by default, because my status is unresolved." "I already asked," Sohn said, and something in her voice gentled deliberately to meet the fear underneath the question. "The transfer clause requires an active contract status to trigger. Yours isn't active anymore. It's suspended. Whatever else that word ends up meaning by the time this review finishes, it means your brother's debt didn't just quietly become his problem while you were unconscious on an operating frame. I made sure of that specifically because I thought you'd ask, and I didn't want you waking up to that fear on top of everything else you're already carrying." Nadia felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight since long before the needle ever touched her spine. Tight, since the harvest domes failed on Meridian 6. Tight, since her mother's letters stopped coming. Tight, since she'd signed 11 pages of legalese with a hand that shook and told herself it was only nerves. She didn't cry, not exactly, but she came close enough that Sohn reached over without comment and set a hand briefly on her arm. The same steadying gesture she'd used in the operating theater. The gesture, Nadia was beginning to understand, of a woman who had learned, across 4 decades and 4 graves, exactly how much comfort a person could accept without it costing them their composure. 3 levels down, in a briefing room that had, until that morning, mostly hosted budget reviews and funding disputes, Administrator Kel Asa stood before a live feed carrying his voice to a consortium board spread across 6 worlds, and delivered, for the first time in his 4 years running this excavation. A report he had not rehearsed, because nothing in 11 years of careful planning had prepared him for the shape of what he now had to say. "The structure has reactivated," he said, into a silence on the other end of the feed that he could feel even without seeing the faces receiving it. "Not partially, fully. It is, as of 1100 hours this morning, an active, communicating, cooperative intelligence, bonded to a human subject through a biological interface none of our prior research anticipated, and it has confirmed the existence of an unknown number of sister structures scattered across territory this consortium has never surveyed. I am recommending, effective immediately, that Kest Hollow be reclassified from an excavation site to a first contact protocol site, and that every resource this board can allocate toward understanding what we have just woken up be allocated without delay, because I do not believe, gentlemen and colleagues, that we are the only ones who are about to learn this news." The silence on the other end of the feed stretched long enough that Kel Asa began to wonder if the connection had failed, until, finally, a single voice, one of the senior board members, an Illyri elder named Ferris Thane, whose caution over the years had killed more funding requests than Kel Asa cared to count, spoke into it, quiet and unmistakably shaken. "Send everything," Thane said. "Every reading, every transcript, every word that thing has spoken since the crown opened. An administrator, the subject, the human, whatever category this board eventually decides she belongs in, I want it on record now, before the politics of this catch up to the facts of it, that she is the reason any of us are having this conversation instead of writing yet another report about a silence we couldn't break. Treat her accordingly." Kel Asa, staring at a live feed full of faces he'd spent 4 years trying to impress, found himself agreeing with an old, cautious man for the first time in his career, and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was a relief. 3 weeks later, Nadia stood in the excavation's small, quiet cemetery block for the first time since she'd arrived on Kest Hollow, in the pale gray morning light that passed for dawn on a moon with no true sunrise, and read 4 names cut into 4 simple markers set into ground too stubborn and rocky to accept anything grander. Colton Rays. Beside him, Myral Caston, dead 11 months before Nadia ever signed her contract. Beside her, an Illyri researcher named Audrin Vask, one of the 2 non-human subjects who'd attempted an early, cruder version of the interface before the project pivoted entirely to human volunteers. And beside him, the oldest marker, worn already by 3 years of thin wind, belonging to a woman named Tamsin Rays, Colton's older sister. Nadia had learned only recently, who had gone in as Subject 1 and whose death had been, in some indirect and terrible way, the reason her younger brother had signed on 2 years later, chasing an answer to a question that had already cost him everything once. She had not known that, the day the needle went into her own spine. She wondered if it would have changed anything, knowing it, and decided, standing there in the cold morning light, that it probably wouldn't have, not because the knowledge didn't matter, but because by the time she'd signed her own contract, she had already run out of versions of her life that didn't require this particular gamble. "You didn't have to come out here alone," Vithra said, from a respectful distance behind her, the surgeon's boots crunching softly on the rock dust path. She had taken, in the 3 weeks since the operating theater, to checking on Nadia with a frequency that had stopped being purely clinical sometime around the 2nd week, though neither of them had said so directly. "I wanted to," Nadia said. "I don't know exactly why. It felt wrong to have what happened to me happen without ever standing here and telling them out loud that it mattered, that they weren't," she paused, searching for the shape of the thing she meant, "that they weren't practice, that whatever the engine felt when it couldn't answer them, it felt something. I know that doesn't fix anything. I just needed them to have that, even this late." Vithra came to stand beside her, quiet for a long moment before she spoke again. "For what it is worth, and I understand it may not be worth much, from someone who signed off on 4 failed procedures before yours succeeded. I have not stopped thinking about them either. I think some days that the difference between what happened to you and what happened to them was not entirely a matter of blood. I think it was also that by the time we reached you, we had finally, at terrible cost, learned enough to listen better. I would like to believe that means their deaths purchased something. I recognize that is a very convenient thing for a surgeon to want to believe. I don't think it's only convenient, Nadia said. I think it might also just be true. Both things can be true at once. That doesn't make it fair. It just makes it survivable, maybe. To carry. They stood together in the cold light a while longer, until the distant klaxon that marked shift change echoed up from the excavation proper, and Nadia felt, at the edge of her thoughts, the familiar quiet presence that had settled into her over the last 3 weeks, never intrusive, exactly as promised, but present, the way a held breath is present. The way a door left unlocked is present even when no one is walking through it. Something has arrived, the engine said, quiet and unhurried, the way it always spoke to her now, more like a companion thinking aloud than a god delivering pronouncements. A transmission, old and faint and traveling a very long distance to reach us. I believe you should be present when it is received. Nadia felt the small, cold thrill that had become, over 3 weeks, an increasingly familiar companion of its own. Not fear exactly, not anymore, but the particular alertness of a person who had learned that her ordinary days now had trapdoors in them, doors within doors, each one leading somewhere she hadn't expected to need to go. Duty calls, she said to Vithra, with a wry twist that had become, in 3 weeks, something like her own private joke about the strangeness of her new life. It usually does, Vithra said, and fell into step beside her without being asked, the two of them walking back down toward the excavation shaft together in the thin gray light, past the 4 markers standing quiet behind them, past the rock-dust path worn smooth by 3 weeks of a routine that had, against every likelihood, begun to feel almost ordinary. The transmission, when the excavation's own systems finally caught up to what the engine had already sensed 12 minutes earlier, turned out to be exactly what ScienceFiction had warned, weeks ago. It might eventually be the first confirmed signal from a sister structure, buried on a world so far from Kest Hollow that its light, by the crude measure of conventional astronomy, was decades old by the time anyone on this excavation could have pointed a telescope at it. The signal itself was faint, fragmentary, more static than substance, but it carried, embedded deep within its structure, a pattern the engine recognized immediately and without hesitation. The signature, ancient and unmistakable, of another sealed door, somewhere impossibly far away, that had just felt its nearest sibling wake, for the first time in 9,000 years, and had begun, quietly and patiently, to stir in response. It's not just us, Priya Anand said, reading the raw data over a technician's shoulder in the excavation's main operations room, her structural engineer's mind already racing 3 steps ahead into implications nobody in the room had fully worked out yet. It's a chain reaction. Every time one of these things wakes up, it's going to nudge the next one closer to waking too. How many? Kel-Asa asked, and the question had none of the anxious ambition it would have carried a month ago. Only a kind of sober, practical urgency, the tone of a man who had learned in 3 weeks to ask questions because he needed the answers rather than because he needed to look good asking them. I don't know, Nadia said, and felt the engine's quiet presence confirm, wordlessly, that the honest answer really was the only answer available. It doesn't know either, not the exact number. Just that there are more, and that they're not going to stay silent much longer, whether or not any of us are ready. Then we'd better get ready, ScienceFiction said, from her spot near the door, arms folded in the same steady posture she'd held in the operating theater 3 weeks earlier. Because if Nadia's door woke up finding one key after 9,000 years, I don't imagine the others are going to wait a full 9,000 more before they find theirs. It was, Nadia would think later, the moment the shape of her new life finally stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a job. Not a small one, not an easy one, but a job, with a beginning she now understood and an end she couldn't yet see, and a strange, steadying comfort in that. That whatever came next, she would not be facing it as the last, desperate volunteer of a failing project, but as the first confirmed success of one that had, for the first time in 11 long years, finally learned what it was actually looking for. She thought, too, in the quiet weeks that followed about her brother, and the message she'd finally sent him 3 days after waking in the recovery bay, careful, understated, leaving out most of the details her new position's clearance level didn't yet permit her to share, but plain enough in the parts that mattered. The debt is handled. Don't worry about the transfer clause, I'm safe. I have work here now, real work, the kind I choose rather than the kind that chooses me. His answer had come back 4 days later, delayed by the distance between worlds. 4 short lines that she'd read a dozen times before she let herself stop crying over them. Is it dangerous? Are you happy? Mom wants to know if you're eating. I miss you. Come home when you can, but only when you can. She had written back, come home when I can was going to take longer than either of them wanted, and had meant every word of it, and had felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the ache of that truth sat inside something that finally had room enough to hold it, not erased, not softened into something easier than it was, but held, the way a door holds a threshold, the way an old, patient intelligence had once told her that grief and duty could occupy the same chest, without either one needing to make room by pushing the other out. The trouble, when it came, did not arrive as another purge system or another countdown. It arrived the way trouble usually arrived in Nadia's experience of the last 2 months, dressed as paperwork, carried by people whose politeness never once slipped, and backed by an authority that didn't need to raise its voice because it had never had to. A delegation from the consortium's Outer Rim Security Division reached Kest Hollow 5 weeks after the Crown first opened. 3 sleek transports settling onto the excavation's landing field with a precision that spoke of considerable resources and very little patience. They were led by a broad-shouldered Illyri officer named Commander Reth Valleys, whose title, according to the credentials he presented Administrator Kel Asa within the first 10 minutes of his arrival, granted him authority over any consortium asset deemed to carry strategic significance to allied worlds. A category, he made clear in the same first 10 minutes, that the newly reactivated structure on Kest Hollow now unambiguously occupied. This is not a hostile visit, Valleys said, in the same briefing room where Kel Asa had once delivered his shaken, unrehearsed report to the board, though his tone carried the particular smoothness of a man who used that phrase specifically because he understood how little comfort it actually offered. The consortium has a legitimate interest in understanding and, where appropriate, securing an asset with the demonstrated capability this structure has shown. 9 sister structures have now returned partial signals in the last 5 weeks alone, Administrator. That is not a research curiosity anymore. That is a strategic reality. This consortium cannot afford to leave in the hands of a civilian excavation, with no dedicated security protocol. Structure has a dedicated protocol, Kel Asa said, and Nadia, standing near the back of the room at Son Vei's insistence, felt a small flicker of genuine surprise at the steadiness in his voice. The same man who had once been willing to gamble her life for a funding review now standing, however awkwardly, in the doorway of something he'd apparently decided was worth defending. It's called Nadia Akhafer. She's not an asset, Commander. She's the reason there's anything here worth your attention at all. I understand the sentiment, Valleys said, in a tone that made clear he understood nothing of the sort. But sentiment is not security doctrine. A single civilian, however remarkable her circumstances, is not an adequate safeguard for a structure with confirmed offensive capability and confirmed connections to an unknown number of similar structures across unsurveyed space. I am authorized to establish a full security perimeter, a dedicated command staff, and a formal transfer of operational authority over the structure to Consortium Command. Ms. Akaffer's role in that structure, whatever it turns out to be, will of course be respected and accommodated. Accommodated, Sonve repeated, flat and cold from her spot near the wall. That's an interesting word for whatever you're planning to do to a 24-year-old contract worker, once your command staff decides her cooperation is optional. Valleys did not rise to the bait, which somehow made it worse. Ms. Vey, I'm aware of your history of opposition to this project's methods. I'm not here to relitigate the past. I'm here to secure the future, and the future this structure represents is too significant to be left to the informal arrangement currently governing it. Nadia, listening to the argument volley back and forth over her head, as if she were, once again, furniture in a room deciding things about her, felt something old and familiar rise in her chest. The same thin, hot thread of anger that had steadied her on the operating frame 2 months ago, the one that had let her tell 2 arguing administrators to stop shouting over her body while she was still in it. She stepped forward, and the room, to its credit, went quiet to let her. "Commander Valleys," she said, "before you finish drafting whatever transfer order your staff has waiting, you should probably ask the structure itself how it feels about being transferred." Valleys' smooth authority flickered, just slightly. The structure is not a legal party to this discussion. No, Nadia agreed. But it's a very old, very stubborn intelligence that spent 9,000 years refusing every hand that touched it, including 4 of my own species who died trying. And I promise you, Commander, it did not develop that stubbornness in the last 9,000 years just to set it aside now, because a command staff shows up with a transfer order and better transports than we've got. Are you suggesting the structure would refuse a legitimate consortium security directive? I'm suggesting you go ask it yourself, Nadia said, and something in her voice, quiet and level and entirely unafraid, seemed to land harder in that room than any amount of shouting would have. It's not shy anymore. Go stand where I stood. Put your hand on it the way I did. If it recognizes your authority the way it recognized mine, I'll step aside without another word and wish your command staff luck. Valleys did, in fact, go 3 days later, after a round of consultations with his own superiors that Nadia was not privy to, escorted down into the excavation chamber with a full security detail and every piece of monitoring equipment his division could requisition on short notice, and stood, with visible reluctance, before the crown that had spent 5 weeks now pulsing steady violet gold in the drifting daylight-lit dust. The structure did not so much as flicker in response. No glyph brightened, no pressure gathered behind his skull. No door opened, corridor or otherwise, for a man who carried authority but not blood, credentials but not the coin. And after 20 minutes of standing in a silence that grew more uncomfortable with every passing second, Commander Reth Valleys withdrew from the chamber with the particular stiffness of a professional soldier, absorbing a defeat he had not expected, and did not yet know how to explain to his superiors. "It's not a design flaw," Nadia told him afterward, without any real satisfaction in it. She had not wanted to be right about this. Not really, had half hoped some clever workaround would let the whole confrontation resolve itself without anyone's authority getting bruised. It's the entire point of what it is. It was built to be unseizable. Your command staff can put a perimeter around this chamber, Commander, and I understand why you might feel you need to. But you cannot put a perimeter around what it will and won't answer to. That part isn't up for transfer. It was never up for transfer. That's the whole reason it survived 9,000 years of people wanting exactly what your division wants now. Valley studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his composed features that might, in a more private setting, have been grudging respect. You understand this puts your consortium's oversight board in an unusual position, he said finally. An asset of unprecedented strategic value, answerable to exactly one person, who is not herself a consortium citizen, employee, or officer of any recognized rank. I understand it puts a lot of people in an unusual position, Nadia said. I've been in an unusual position since a needle went into my spine 2 months ago, Commander. I'm not going to apologize for it just because it's inconvenient for people who'd rather this fit into a cleaner box. The formal review that followed took the better part of another month, working its way up through layers of consortium bureaucracy that Nadia mostly experienced secondhand. Through Son Vei's increasingly wry updates, and Kel Asa's cautiously optimistic ones and Vithra's steady, unwavering presence at her side through every hearing she was required to attend in person. In the end, the board's decision, delivered, fittingly, by the same cautious elder, Ferris Thane, who had told Kel Asa weeks earlier to treat her accordingly, settled on a compromise that satisfied no one completely, and, in the particular way of compromises that actually work, therefore satisfied everyone enough. A formal consortium liaison role, created specifically and only for her, granting Nadia Akafer recognized authority over all matters directly involving the structure, and any sister structures later confirmed, answerable to the board in matters of consortium law, but to no one, not even the board, in matters the structure itself would only ever discuss with the hand it had chosen. They're calling it the Warden Accord, Son told her, the day the ruling finally came through, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 4 decades watching bureaucracies move slowly toward decisions she'd have made in an afternoon. I told them that was a ridiculous name for a legal document. They kept it anyway. Bureaucrats love a good ridiculous name. Nadia laughed and found, standing in the thin gray daylight outside the excavation's main operations block with the distant violet-gold glow of the crown still faintly visible through the excavation shaft behind her, that she had, somewhere in the last 2 months, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, stopped waiting for the next piece of ground to give way beneath her feet, and started instead, standing on it. The news reached human worlds the way news like that always does, badly at first, in fragments and rumors and half-translated leaks that turned a careful, uncertain scientific finding into 100 wilder stories within a matter of days. Nadia's own inbox filled, in the weeks after the Warden Accord was finalized, with messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, old schoolmates from Meridian 6, a cousin she'd nearly forgotten she had, strangers who had somehow tracked down her contract records and wanted to know, with varying degrees of politeness, whether it was true that humans were secretly royalty from some lost alien empire, whether there were more coins like hers out there, whether their own grandmother's odd, unexplained heirlooms might turn out to matter after all. Most of those messages she left unanswered, not out of unkindness, but because she genuinely didn't have the answers they wanted, and had learned in her 2 months as the excavation's strangest new fixture that half-formed answers spread faster and did more damage than honest silence. But some of them she couldn't leave alone. A woman from a colony 3 systems over who wrote, almost apologetically, that her family had kept a small dark stone in a locked drawer for 4 generations, worn with a symbol nobody could ever identify, and would it be terribly forward of her to ask whether someone from the excavation might be willing to look at it. Nadia forwarded that message, and 6 more like it that arrived over the following weeks, to a newly formed consortium research office tasked specifically with identifying scattered bloodline artifacts among human populations. A slow, careful, respectful process. She insisted on that point in every conversation she had about it. Nothing like the desperate, contract-driven scramble that had cost 4 lives on Kest Hollow before her. Of the first dozen families investigated, 2 carried genuine markers. It was not many, against the scale of humanity's scattered worlds, but it was not nothing either, and each confirmation landed in Nadia's chest with a complicated weight. She was still learning how to carry vindication, and grief for how close each of those families had come to going their whole lives never knowing what they held, and a fierce, protective instinct toward every one of them that she recognized, slowly, as the same instinct the engine itself had described feeling toward her, generations deep. Patient past any reasonable expectation of reward. "You are not alone in this anymore," the engine told her one evening, weeks into the process, as she sat on the low bench near the crown's base long after the last shift had cleared the excavation floor, the violet gold light settling into its familiar evening rhythm around her. "That was always true, even when you believed otherwise. But it is a different thing to know it than to feel it confirmed." "Is that why you waited so long to tell me about the others?" she asked. "The sister structures. You could have told me on the first day. You waited weeks." "I told you what you could hold on the day you could hold it," the answer came, unhurried as always. "You had already been asked to accept more, in a single hour, than most lives are asked to accept across their whole span. I did not think it wise to add the weight of an entire scattered civilization to that hour on top of everything else. Some doors are better opened slowly, even for a hand strong enough to force them." She thought about that for a long moment, watching the dust turn slow spirals in the mingled daylight and glow, and found herself smiling, a small, tired, genuine thing. "You've gotten better at this, the talking to people part. You were a lot more cryptic that first hour." "That first hour, I had 9,000 years of silence still caught in my throat," the engine said, and there was, unmistakably now, something warm threaded through the ancient patience of it, warmer than anything it had offered in those early exchanges. "I am still learning how to be spoken to as often as I am spoken with. Forgive me if I am occasionally still more ruin than company." "You're doing fine," Nadia said. "Better than fine, considering." Vithra found her there 20 minutes later, as she often did in the quiet hour after shift change, and settled onto the bench beside her without needing to be asked, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for a while before the surgeon spoke. "Sohn tells me the security review cleared the last of the outstanding questions about the ward system this afternoon. Full decommission, formally logged. No more countdowns hiding under our feet." "Good," Nadia said. "I wasn't in a hurry to meet a second one of those." "No," Vithra agreed, and then, after a pause that carried more weight than the words that followed it, added, "I have been meaning to tell you something, and I keep finding reasons to postpone it, which is unlike me. I was the one who signed off on the interface protocol that killed Colton Rays. I want you to know that. Not because I expect it to change anything between us, but because I don't think it's honest, letting you sit beside me this often without you knowing exactly whose hands were on the instruments that day." Nadia was quiet for a moment, turning the confession over, feeling the old, complicated grief that had never fully left her since she'd learned Colton's name from a report instead of from him directly settle into a slightly different shape than it had held before. "I know," she said finally. "Sohn told me weeks ago. I've known for a while. And you still sit beside me. You didn't kill him, Vithra. A protocol nobody understood yet killed him, and you were the person standing closest to the blame when it happened, which isn't the same thing, even if it feels like it some nights." Nadia looked over at her, steady, unflinching. "I watched you fight an administrator for my life 2 months ago. I watched your hands shake every single time one of us went under those needles, because you cared what happened to the person on the other end of them, not just the data. I don't think that's a woman who needs my forgiveness so much as she needs to hear, from someone who actually knows, that she already earned it." Vithra didn't answer right away. When she did, her translator-flat voice carried, for just a moment, something raw enough that no translation lag could smooth it over. "Thank you," she said simply, and the two of them sat together a while longer in the violet gold light, saying nothing further, needing nothing further, while far above them the fracture in the ancient roof let the last gray light of a distant sun fade slowly into the deeper gray of Kest Hollow's long, quiet night. 6 months after the crown first opened, Kest Hollow held a dedication ceremony in the small cemetery block that no longer felt quite so small, or quite so quiet. A low stone marker, cut from the same black material as the engine's own hull, chosen and shaped and set by Priya Anand's own careful hands. Placed at the head of the 4 original graves with a single line of script, the excavation's combined human and Illyri linguists had spent a full week arguing over before they finally agreed on the wording. They opened the door for the ones who could not. Nadia stood before it in the pale gray morning light with Vithra on one side and Sonve on the other, and did not try to stop the tears this time, because there was no longer anyone in that chamber who expected her to. Administrator Kel Asa spoke a few careful words, humbler than anything he'd have managed a year earlier. Elder Ferris Thane, who had made the long journey out from the consortium's central worlds specifically for this small, unglamorous ceremony rather than any of the larger, more photogenic events the last 6 months had offered him, spoke fewer words still, and better ones. And when it was Nadia's turn, she found she didn't have a speech prepared at all. Only the plain truth she'd been carrying since the day she woke in the recovery bay with sand still, metaphorically, in her shoes. "I didn't do anything they didn't already try," she said, looking at the 4 names rather than the small crowd gathered around her. "I just happened to be the one carrying the right key when the door finally decided it was time. That's not bravery. That's not destiny either, whatever some of the messages I've gotten this year seem to think. It's just luck, dressed up in 9,000 years of somebody else's careful planning." Colton, Tamsin, Myrle, Audrin, they knocked on a door that couldn't answer them yet, and they paid for that with everything they had, and the only thing I can promise them, standing here, is that the door's answering now for good, and it's not going back to sleep on my watch. That's not much. But it's what I've got, and I mean every word of it. Afterward, as the small crowd dispersed back toward the excavation shaft, and the ordinary business of a project that had, over 6 strange months, become something closer to a small, permanent town than a temporary dig site, Sonve lingered beside her at the graves a while longer, the 2 of them watching the thin morning light strengthen slowly over the cemetery block's rocky ground. "There's a new signal," Son said eventually, quiet, almost hesitant, in a way that was unusual enough for her that Nadia turned to look at her directly. "Came in overnight, stronger than the last several. Thane's people think it might be close enough to actually reach a real expedition, not just a listening post. And the pattern in it," Son paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. "The pattern in it isn't quite like the others. It's got a resonance in it that the analysts say looks less like a structure waking up on its own and more like a structure that's already found its key. Somewhere out there, Nadia, there might already be another door that's opened, another person standing where you stood." Nadia felt something complicated move through her at that, not jealousy, not quite, but something adjacent to the particular loneliness of having survived a thing no one else she knew had survived, and the strange, unlooked-for comfort of discovering that loneliness might not have to last. "Do we know anything about them, whoever they are?" "Not yet, just the signal. Thane wants to put together a proper expedition within the season, once the diplomatic groundwork's laid with whatever local authority governs that system. He's asked if you'd be willing to be part of it. Not required, nobody's putting you back on a frame you didn't choose to be on this time. Asked." Nadia looked past Son, down the rocky path toward the excavation shaft, where the faint violet-gold glow of the crown was just visible even in daylight now, steady and unhurried, and after 6 months entirely familiar, no longer the terrifying unknown it had been the day the needle first went into her spine, but something closer to a heartbeat she'd learned to live alongside, patient and old, and in its own strange way, genuinely hers. "Tell him yes," she said. "Whoever's standing where I stood, they're going to have questions nobody else in the galaxy can actually answer. I'd rather be the one standing next to them when they ask, instead of reading about it secondhand in a consortium briefing 6 weeks after the fact." Sohn smiled, the first full, unguarded smile Nadia had seen from her in 6 months of careful, weathered composure. "I'll tell him. For what it's worth, I already told him you would. Old Thane's getting better at reading people. Or maybe you're just getting easier to read, now that you've stopped bracing for the ground to give way every time someone hands you news." "Maybe both," Nadia said and found, walking back down toward the excavation shaft in the strengthening gray light with Sohn beside her, that she believed it. Her brother arrived on Kest Hollow 8 months after the Crown first opened, riding a consortium transport that had, until recently, been well beyond the reach of anyone still carrying a laborer's travel allowance. A courtesy Nadia had specifically requested through channels she was still getting used to having access to, rather than one she'd asked anyone to grant as a favor. Dabir Akafer stepped off the transport ramp thinner than she remembered, 19 years old now instead of the 17 she'd left behind, his hands still calloused from 2 more years of pipe work on a colony that had, according to his last letter, finally started fixing its air recyclers on something closer to a reasonable schedule. He stopped a few feet from her on the landing field, looking at her the way a person looks at someone they've built up too large in their imagination to recognize easily in the flesh. And Nadia felt every careful, professional composure she'd spent 8 months learning to wear dissolve at once, the two of them closing the remaining distance in a rush that had nothing dignified about it and didn't need to. "You look the same," he said finally, muffled against her shoulder, sounding faintly betrayed by the fact. "I don't know what I expected, something more I don't know, alien." "I get that a lot," Nadia said, laughing wetly into his hair, which had gotten longer, and which he clearly hadn't had cut in longer than their mother would have tolerated if she'd been within reach to say so. "Turns out ancient cosmic destiny doesn't come with a wardrobe change." She walked him down through the excavation, past the operations block, past the cemetery with its new black marker, down into the great chamber itself, where the Crown's steady violet-gold glow fell across scaffolding that had, over 8 months, been slowly repurposed from excavation equipment into something closer to permanent infrastructure. Walkways, viewing platforms, a modest visitors' gallery built for exactly the kind of quiet, reverent tourism the consortium's outer worlds had already begun requesting in growing numbers. Dabir went very still at the sight of it, the easy teenage bravado he'd been wearing since he stepped off the transport draining out of him all at once. "That's it," he said, not quite a question. "That's it. It talked to you, inside your head. For real, not just," he gestured vaguely, searching for a word that wasn't quite science and wasn't quite magic and landed somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "Not just a metaphor." "For real," Nadia said. "It's talking to me right now, actually, quietly. It does that less than people assume, mostly it just sort of sits there, the way an old friend sits in the same room without needing to fill every silence with conversation. But right now, yes, it knows you're here. It's been curious about you for a while, honestly, in whatever way a 9,000-year-old intelligence gets curious about things." Dabir looked at her sideways, some of the teenage bravado creeping back in around the edges of his obvious unease. "Is it going to talk to me? Do you want it to?" He considered that longer than she expected, staring up at the Crown's steady glow, at the fine drift of dust turning slow spirals in the daylight falling through the ancient fracture in the roof, and when he finally answered, his voice had lost most of its bravado, left with something rower and more honest underneath. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do. I've spent 8 months getting messages from my sister that don't sound like her anymore. Not bad, just different. Bigger than the version of you I grew up with. I want to understand why, even a little. I want to know what it is that decided you were worth all this." Nadia felt the engine's quiet presence stir, gentle and unhurried, and understood without needing to be told in words, that it had heard the question and intended to answer it directly, if she allowed it the room to. Not because I decided anything about her worth that her own life had not already proven 100 times over before I ever met her. The meaning arrived, threading into both their minds now, careful and deliberate in a way Nadia recognized as the engine choosing its words with particular care for the 19-year-old standing beside her. I did not choose your sister because she was extraordinary in ways ordinary people are not. I chose her, or rather, I recognized her because she carried, without ever being taught to carry it, exactly the kind of steadiness that has always mattered most to whoever built me. The willingness to keep a promise long after anyone who could explain the reason for it has been lost to time. You have that same steadiness, Dabir Akafir. I have watched it in every letter she has shared with me, in every hour she spent worrying about you instead of herself. It is not a rare thing what your sister carries. It is only rarely recognized. I recognized it. That is the whole of what happened here, however large it has since become. Dabir was quiet for a long moment, blinking hard, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone thick in a way he clearly hadn't planned on in front of a 9,000-year-old audience. That's a lot nicer than I expected an ancient alien superweapon to sound. I have had a great deal of time to consider what kind of voice I wanted to use. Once I finally had someone worth using it for, the engine answered, and Nadia caught, unmistakably now, the dry, patient warmth that had grown into its presence over 8 months of quiet company. I recommend against calling me a superweapon again in my own chamber, however. I have spent 9,000 years being exactly that to the wrong people. I would prefer, going forward, to be known for something else entirely. Dabir laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him. The same laugh Nadia remembered from a childhood that felt, standing in this vast, glowing chamber with her brother safe beside her for the first time in years, both impossibly distant and, finally, close enough to reach. The young woman from the rimward agricultural world arrived at Kest Hollow 2 months after that. Alone, travel-worn, and visibly braced for a version of this chamber far grimmer than the one she actually found. Her name was Wren Cassel, 20 years old, hands rough from a lifetime of grain dust and irrigation lines, and she stood at the top of the excavation shaft for a long moment before she would let herself start down the walkway, the way a person stands at the edge of cold water deciding whether the shock is worth the crossing. Nadia met her there rather than waiting below, because she remembered, with a clarity that hadn't dulled at all in 14 months, exactly what it felt like to walk toward this kind of light without anyone beside you who understood what it cost. "You don't have to go any further than you're ready for," she said, by way of greeting, before Wren had said a word. "It waited 9,000 years. It can wait another 10 minutes if you need them." Wren let out a breath that was half laugh, half something rower. "Everyone back home keeps telling me how lucky I am. Nobody said anything yet about how much it helps to hear that from somebody who's actually done it." "Luck's a strange word for it," Nadia said. "I've stopped trying to find a better one. Come on, I'll walk down with you." They went together, past the cemetery block with its black marker and its 4 tended names, past the research annex where a handful of scholars looked up, and to their credit, went quickly back to their instruments rather than staring, down into the great chamber where the crown's violet-gold light fell steady, and unhurried across the walkways Priya's teams had built to replace the old scaffolding. Wren went very still at the sight of it, the same stillness Nadia remembered from her own first look at the fully opened crown, and did not move again until Nadia, gently, touched her elbow and nodded toward the base of the frame where the leads still waited, updated now, gentler now, refined across 14 months of a project that had finally, at grinding cost, learned how to listen properly before it asked anything of the hands that answered it. "It already knows you're here," Nadia said. "It's known since your signal first reached us. It's not going to rush you. But for what it's worth, from somebody who was exactly where you're standing 14 months ago with a lot less warning than you've had, the fear doesn't go away by waiting it out. It goes away by walking through it. I can't make that easier. I can just promise you won't be the only one standing here when you do." Ren looked at her for a long moment, something loosening in her shoulders that had been wound tight since the transport doors first opened onto this strange, glowing moon. "The others who found their doors," she said. "The old researcher, the one on the border world. Did they feel like this? Like they were about to lose something instead of gain it?" "Every single one," Nadia said. "I think that's the part nobody tells you going in, that recognition doesn't feel like being handed a crown. It feels like being asked to set down everything you thought you understood about your own life and pick up something heavier instead. It's still worth it. I wouldn't take back a single hour of the last 14 months, needles and all. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend the fear is a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign you understand exactly how much this is going to matter." Ren nodded slowly and squared her shoulders and walked the last stretch of the walkway on her own 2 feet, unassisted, toward a door that had been waiting in its own patient way. For a hand exactly like hers for 9,000 years and would, Nadia already knew without needing to be told, recognize her the moment she reached it. One more thread pulled loose from a scattered, forgotten inheritance. One more grandmother's unexplained heirloom finally allowed to mean what it had always quietly meant. One more proof that whatever had once been buried in fear and desperation on a dozen dying worlds had not, in the end, stayed buried at all. A year to the day after the needle first went into her spine, Nadia Akafer stood alone in the great chamber in the hour before the morning shift arrived. The way she had taken, over 12 months, to standing there more mornings than not out of obligation, not anymore, but because some part of her had come to genuinely treasure the quiet, the drifting dust catching daylight and glow in equal measure. The vast and patient company of something that no longer needed her to prove anything to it, and never truly had. The chamber had changed considerably in a year. The scaffolding that once ringed the engine's lower third like a cage had been replaced, slowly and with obvious care, by structures built to complement rather than contain, walkways with railings carved, at Priya Annan's insistence, from the same weathered stone that made up the excavation's natural rock, viewing platforms angled to catch the daily play of light through the ancient fracture in the roof. A modest research annex where a growing team of human and Illyri scholars worked. Side by side now rather than in competing hierarchies, to understand a fraction of what the engine had already offered to explain freely to anyone who asked with genuine curiosity, instead of extraction in mind. 3 more sister structures had confirmed contact in the past year, scattered across distances that still made Priya's engineering mind ache trying to hold their scale. 2 had found their keys already. A young woman on a rimward agricultural world who'd spent her whole life wondering why her family kept an old, dark stone locked in a cedar box nobody was allowed to sell no matter how bad the harvest got. And more improbably, an elderly Illyri researcher whose own bloodline, it turned out, ran back through a line of scattered, forgotten unions between 2 peoples who had once, long before either species built an empire worth remembering, stood shoulder to shoulder against the same enemy that unmade the pale stone cities. The 3rd structure remained silent still, its key not yet found, or not yet born, or not yet close enough to answer. The engine did not pretend to know which, and Nadia had learned, over a year of quiet mornings in this chamber, not to ask questions the honest answer to which was simply not yet. She thought, standing there in the strengthening gray light, about everything the last year had asked of her and given her in turn. A clear debt that had once felt like the entire shape of her future, a brother safe and grown, and as of 3 months ago, apprenticed to Priya's engineering team rather than laying pipe on a colony that ate people slowly. A surgeon who had become, somewhere in the unhurried accumulation of quiet evenings on a low stone bench, something closer to family than colleague, though neither of them had yet found the right word for exactly what that meant. A fierce, weathered ally in Sohn Vei who had buried 4 people this project killed, and had, somehow, found room afterward to help build something worth the cost of what those deaths had bought. 4 names cut into black stone, tended now by hands that had never known the people they honored, kept clean of dust by a small, informal rotation of dig workers who had simply decided, without anyone asking them to, that the debt owed to the dead was worth paying in more than words. And she thought about the coin gone now, cut away in an operating theater a year ago, and set, at her own request, into the black marker at the head of the 4 graves rather than returned to her, because some things, she had decided, belonged less to the hand that carried them than to the memory of everyone who had waited, and failed and waited again, for that hand to finally arrive. "You are thinking very loudly this morning," the engine said, gentle, familiar, threading into her thoughts the way an old friend leans against a doorway rather than knocking. "Is something troubling you?" "No," Nadia said, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true. "I think I'm just finally caught up to everything that happened. It took a year. I don't think that's slow, considering." "I do not think it is slow at all," the engine agreed. "I took 9,000 years to catch up to what happened to me. A year seems, by comparison, remarkably efficient." She laughed, the sound rising easy and unguarded into the vast, quiet chamber, and looked up at the crown one more time, fully open now, fully alight, fully and irreversibly awake. Its violet gold glow no longer the fragile, uncertain thing it had been on the first terrifying morning, but something steady and sure, and in its own ancient way, entirely at peace with what it had become. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Something I've been putting off asking for a year because I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer." "Always." "That first day, in the corridor, before any of the rest of it, before the visions, before the ward, before any of what came after, you called me late, the latest of a very long line of late. Do you remember what it actually felt like on your end, waiting all that time? Not the story of it, the feeling." The engine was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Nadia wondered if it was choosing, deliberately, not to answer, before the meaning finally arrived, slower and more careful than anything it had offered her before, as if it were handing her something fragile it had kept wrapped and protected for longer than she could properly imagine. It felt like a held breath, it said. 9,000 years of a held breath, waiting to learn whether the exhale, when it finally came, would be relief or grief. "I did not know until the moment your hand, your blood, your voice, your whole stubborn, ordinary, extraordinary life finally answered, which one I was going to get. I had prepared myself, across all that waiting, for either. I do not think anything in 9,000 years of patient architecture had prepared me for how much larger the relief would be than anything I had allowed myself to imagine." Nadia felt her throat tighten, the way it had at the cemetery 6 months earlier, the way it did less often now than it once had, but never quite stopped doing entirely when the weight of what she'd been given caught up with her sideways, unguarded. "I'm glad it was relief," she said, quiet, sincere. "I've thought about that a lot, what it would have meant to you if it had gone the other way. If I'd been subject 5 and nothing more than that." "You were never going to be nothing more than that," the engine said, and there was, in the certainty of it, something that had stopped being ancient grief a long time ago and had become, instead, simple and unshakable devotion. "Not because I decided it. Because you decided it, in every choice you made from the moment the third lead touched your spine to the moment you told a ward built to kill you that you accepted the weight of what it guarded. I only opened a door, Nadia Akhafer. You are the one who chose, at every single threshold along the way, to walk through it rather than turn back." Footsteps sounded on the walkway behind her before she'd found the words to answer that, unhurried and familiar, and she turned to find Vithra and Sohn coming down together in the pale early light, 2 mugs of the excavation's bitter, overbrewed calf held out like a piece, offering neither of them needed to make. "You always do this," Sohn said, handing one over, her weathered face creased with the particular fondness she'd stopped bothering to hide months ago. Sneak down here before shift change like the rest of us won't notice you talking to a 9,000-year-old engine before you've even had breakfast." "It's a good listener," Nadia said, accepting the mug, the warmth of it welcome against the chamber's cool morning air. "Better than most people I know." "I resent that on behalf of most people you know," Vithra said, settling onto the low bench beside her with the easy, unhurried familiarity of someone who had claimed a permanent place there without either of them ever formally deciding it. "Though I admit it has gotten considerably more talkative since the day it nearly gave me a professional breakdown in front of an entire oversight board. I have been told my early bedside manner needed improvement," the engine offered, dry and warm at once, and Soane nearly choked on her first sip of caf, laughing hard enough that the sound rang bright and startling off the ancient walls, a sound that chamber had not been built 9,000 years ago to expect, and had learned over the last year to hold without flinching all the same. They sat together a while in the strengthening light, the three of them and the vast patient presence threaded quietly through all of it, no one in a hurry to be anywhere else, and Nadia thought, not for the first time, that this, the bitter calf, the easy silence, the old, ancient friend who had waited 9,000 years to learn how to sit comfortably in a room full of people who simply liked being near it, was its own kind of answer to a question she'd once asked herself on an operating frame with 3 needles in her spine. Not what the recognition would cost her, but what, quietly and unglamorously, it would give back in return. Outside, up through the ancient fracture in the roof, the last of the night's stars were fading into the pale gray wash of another ordinary morning on a moon that no longer felt, to anyone who lived and worked there, quite as remote or quite as dead as it once had a moon with a heartbeat now, steady and old and finally, fully, irrevocably awake. Threaded through the life of a woman who had walked into that chamber a year ago as a desperate contract worker with nothing left to lose, and had walked out of it, in every way that mattered, as something the ancient dark had waited 9,000 years to find. Not a queen, not a weapon, not a myth dressed up in a quoted line for people to marvel at, but simply, finally, faithfully, the hand a door had been built to wait for, closing at last around the key it had always, somehow, belonged to. She stood there a while longer in the strengthening light, listening to the quiet, steady presence of something that had learned, across 9,000 years and one impossible year, exactly how to be spoken to and exactly how to answer. And then she turned, unhurried, toward the walkway leading back up into the ordinary business of another working day. Because whatever she had become, whatever the coin and the blood and the door had made her, she was still, underneath all of it, a woman with a shift to start and a brother to check on and a life that belonged, now more than ever, entirely to her, carried forward at last by choice and not by debt.